Szeth Sansan Vallano, truthless of Shinovar, wore white on the day he was to kill a king. Possessed of powers granted to him by a blade once wielded by a demigod, he carves a bloody path through the royal palace of Kholinar, where he finds his quarry. King Gavilar, a warrior and conqueror, faces his assassin head-on in a magical suit of armor, which makes him invincible against practically any foe. Unfortunately for him, the assassin in white is not just any foe. A year passes, and the kingdom of Alethkar fights for vengeance against the race of mysterious crab-like non-humans who ordered the death of their king. A slave, brought to the front lines of this conflict, is forced to carry bridges across the chasms of war. A young, sheltered noblewoman embarks on a heist to steal a priceless artifact from the greatest scholar in the world. An aging warlord contends with the treacherous politics of Alethkar's high princes, struggling to unite them against their common foe. As the fates of these three unlikely heroes become slowly entwined, an ancient evil slowly awakens. The Everstorm approaches, and the True Desolation comes. Welcome to our series on the Stormlight Archive. Sit back, relax, and join us as we take you on a tour of the world of Roshar, introducing you to its people, its magics, and its fantastical alien landscape, before telling an abridged version of its history. This video will serve as a recap of the highlights of the first 4 Stormlight Archive novels, so be warned, spoilers lie ahead. The Stormlight Archive is the brainchild of modern fantasy's most prolific author, Brandon Sanderson. It takes place on the planet of Roshar, which is part of the Cosmere, the interstellar universe in which all of Sanderson's other popular fantasy series also take place. There are 13 planets in the Rosharan solar system, 3 of which are inhabited. Ashin and Braze, the first and third planet from the Sun, are both home to sapient life, but Roshar, which orbits between them, is by far the most highly populated. As the name Stormlight Archive suggests, Roshar's defining feature is its extreme weather patterns. The planet's single supercontinent is regularly ravaged by massive, world-spanning hurricanes known as high storms. High storms are forces of incredible destructive power, traveling across the planet's surface at an average of 370 miles per hour. The storm wall, the leading edge of the tempest, manifests as a churning vortex of dust, water, and deracinated debris that strips the land bare and shreds anyone unlucky enough to face it head-on. High storms occur once every few days, always beginning in the east and blowing towards the west. They are strongest at their eastern origin, before slowly weakening as they progress westward. Life on Roshar has adapted to the reality of the high storms, resulting in a biosphere which appears bizarre and alien to people from Earth. There is no topsoil on the majority of the planet, for the unforgiving winds would strip it away. Most flora on Roshar are rock buds, a family of plant species which grow directly out of sheer stone and have stone-like shells. As an evolutionary adaptation against high storms, many plants on Roshar are highly reactive to motion and will retract into their shells, withdraw into cracks in the stone, or flatten against the ground when poked or stepped on. However, not all of Roshar's herbage is at the mercy of the winds. Scattered across the continent are lates, sheltered pockets of land protected from high storms by eastward-facing cliffs that break the winds. Lates are to storm-ravaged Roshar what oases are to a desert, places where plant life grows more densely than anywhere else on the planet. The vast majority of animals on Roshar are crustaceans, with thick shells that protect them from the extreme weather of their natural habitat. These vary wildly in size and ecological niche, from tiny skittering kremlings to massive creatures like the reclusive marine santhid or the vicious man-eating chasm fiend. Even animals domesticated by humans are crab-like. On Roshar, wagons are not pulled by oxen but by lumbering six-legged chulls, and the beloved family pet isn't a darling golden retriever but a hexapedal fish-tailed axehound. The one exception to Roshar's surreal ecology is the land of Shinovar. Protected from the high storms by an impenetrable mountain range, Shinovar's landscape is noticeably more Earth-like in character, featuring rich soil, grassy plains, and a variety of mammal and bird species like horses, pigs, chickens, and chickens. In a humorous inversion of our own Earth-like sensibilities, most cultures on Roshar consider Shinovar to be an unsettlingly alien land. As bizarre and dreamlike as Roshar is, its dominant sapient species is one most familiar indeed. Human civilization can be found in nearly every corner of the supercontinent, organized mostly into feudal or tribal societies. Despite being soft, squishy creatures with no protective carapace, humanity has learned to thrive in this wind-beaten world with settlements designed to withstand high storms, built within the protective embrace of sheltered lakes, tucked into steep canyons, or manually carved into the ground itself. Roshar is a planet of remarkable cultural diversity. However, many of its nations share the most dominant religion in the land, Vorinism. Vorinism is a monotheistic faith which worships a god called the Almighty, the creator of mankind. Vorin scripture teaches that in a time before time, humanity lived in the loving embrace of their creator in a heavenly realm known as the Tranquiline Halls. All was idyllic until heaven was attacked by the Voidbringers, wicked creatures forged in a hellish dimension called Damnation. Mankind fled to Roshar, where they battled with the Voidbringers time and time again. During each of these wars, humankind was led by a pantheon of 10 immortal demigods, known as the Heralds, 5 men and 5 women chosen by the Almighty himself to guide humanity to victory. Each herald led an order of warriors who collectively were known as the Knights Radiant, with the Voidbringers often manifesting as massive, stone-skinned monsters, impervious to regular weapons of iron and bronze. The Almighty bestowed the Heralds and the Radiants with shard blades, invincible, divinely blessed weapons capable of carving through the hellish hordes. Finally came Aharietium, the last desolation, where the Voidbringers were defeated for the final time and cast back into the Tranquiline Halls. The Heralds pursued, leaving humanity to rebuild their lives on Roshar as they ascended heavensward to drive the demons from the Almighty's hallowed realm. Some generations later, the Knights Radiant, now without the guidance of the Heralds, laid down their blades and turned their backs on humanity in an event known as the Day of Recreance. According to most estimates, the last desolation occurred over 4,500 years ago. In the modern age, the Voidbringers, the Heralds, and the Knights Radiant are naught but distant memories. Today, living in a Vorin nation means being subject to a docket of restrictive social norms. For one thing, Vorin society is deeply gendered. War and politics are considered the domain of men, while literature, art, and scholarship are the exclusive province of women. To Vorins, the idea of a female soldier is considered deeply improper, but then again, so too is the idea of a man who can read and write. Since feminine arts are often defined as that which can be done one-handed, Vorin women are expected to cover up their left hands, known as their safe hands, while in public. Vorin society is not just gender restrictive, but class restrictive as well. In Vorin kingdoms, there exists a rigid caste system predicated on eye color. Those with light-colored eyes are born to rule, while those with dark-colored eyes are born to serve. Royalty and nobility in Vorin kingdoms are exclusively light-eyed, with hues of azure blue, bright hazel, violet, yellow, and emerald green, while peasants are exclusively dark-eyed, with irises of muddled brown and black. A light-eyed woman must be a distinguished scholar, while a dark-eyed woman might be a humble seamstress. Light-eyed men are battalion lords, while dark-eyed men are restricted to being drill sergeants and common foot soldiers. The various kingdoms that follow the Vorin faith are all unique in their own way, and there are also many nations and tribes who are not Vorin at all. Let us use this as a segue to do a survey of some of Roshar's cultures and peoples. The Alethi are a stoic people, distinguishable by their tan skin, straight black hair, and their tall stature. Devoutly Vorin, the Alethi variant of the faith considers soldiery to be a man's highest religious calling. Consequently, the Alethi are a bellicose people, constantly warring both against their neighbours and among themselves. Where the Alethi are proud and aloof, the Hadazian people are tight-knit, passionate, and rambunctious. Their most distinctive physical characteristics are their crystalline slate-like fingernails, which hint at some non-human blood in their distant ancestry. Although mostly found in the Kingdom of Hadaz, there are large Hadazian diaspora communities in Alethkar and Jakaved. Native to the southern kingdom of Thaylena, the Thaylen people are instantly recognizable by their exceptionally long white eyebrows, which they often ornament with jewelry. The Thaylens are a thalassocratic people, and are bar none Roshar's most skilled sailors. They are also its most prolific tradesmen, with Thaylen merchants being found in every port, market and bazaar on the continent. In stark contrast to the worldly Thaylens are the reclusive, mountain-dwelling Unkalaki. A stout people with distinctive red hair and pale skin, they tower over most other humans, even the Alethi. Living in villages nestled against warm thermal hot springs, high in the otherwise frigid Hornita peaks, the Unkalaki are known for their strong teeth and jaws. As such, their eating habits involve crunching directly down on Roshar's various edible crustaceans, thick shells and all. The Makibaki people, who populate the Empire of Azir and its many client states, are short in stature and dark brown in skin. Unlike the Unkalaki, they are not a Vorian people, so their rulers are not determined by eye colour. The government in Azir is a scholarly meritocracy. Even the position of Emperor or Prime Acquisix is determined by who can write the most convincing essay. Indeed, the Makibaki are an extremely litigious bunch, and have an official application process for everything, from special dietary restrictions to engaging in a same-sex relationship. This slavish devotion to bureaucracy makes their society inflexible but also stable. Civil wars and succession crises are unheard of in Azir, for they would require too much paperwork. The last human society on Roshar we will mention are the Shin, a xenophobic people rarely seen outside of their homeland of Shinovar, which, as previously mentioned, is the only region of Roshar with an Earth-like ecology. A pale-skinned people, the Shin are the only humans on Roshar who lack epicanthic folds on their eyes, giving them a wide-eyed, almost childlike appearance to most outsiders. The Shin consider stone to be sacred, and consider walking on it to be blasphemy. They have a subversive hierarchy, where farmers, those who grow, are held in the highest regard, and warriors, those who destroy, are considered little more than slaves. Another sapient species that inhabits Roshar are the Parshmen. Humanoid, but not quite human, the Parshmen look strikingly alien, with void black eyes that lack irises and two-coloured marbled skin, featuring swirling patterns of red and black or red and white. Parshmen have extremely limited intelligence, and as such are exploited by humanity, who have reduced them into a slave labour force. Strangely, the Parshmen have responded to their indenturement with an almost robotic indifference. They obey orders without question, and when left to their own devices, they don't try to escape, but simply sit there mindlessly. Parshmen can be found in every human nation, where they are bought and sold as chattel and made to perform the most menial of labours. Like most worlds in the Cosmere, Roshar is replete with investiture, the esoteric essence which powers the various magic systems of Sanderson's stories. Magic is in Roshar's very breath, for as high storms blow from east to west, they blanket the land in a white gaseous vapour known as Stormlight, a substance of raw, untapped investiture. Another manifestation of investiture on Roshar are small spirit-like beings known as spren, which dot its landscape. There are thousands of unique forms of spren, all of whom are drawn to a specific natural phenomenon or emotion. For example, wind spren take the form of ethereal ribbons of light twirling in the breeze, while flame spren appear as tiny humanoid figures made of congealed light dancing about in flickering fireplaces. Laughter spren, minnow-like silver spirits, might appear among a group of friends after the telling of a knee-slapping joke, while pain spren, like small orange hands, often crawl out of the ground around wounded soldiers. Most spren appear to be mindless, no more sapient than the base concepts they embody. Throughout their many millennia on Roshar, humanity has learned how to harness the magic energy of their world. During high storms, people leave out specialized gemstones which absorb stormlight, causing the gemstones to develop a bright glow. These infused gemstones are used for various purposes, but most often as a source of light or as a form of currency. In recent years, scholars have discovered ways of capturing spren inside infused gemstones, which are used to power devices known as fabrials. Fabrial is a generic term for a variety of contraptions which, depending on the combination of spren and gemstone, perform a variety of functions. For example, a flame spren trapped inside a ruby can be harnessed in a fabrial which can be used to heat up a room. One of the most common types of fabrial is the span reed, which allows scribes across the continent to transmit messages to one another across thousands of miles almost instantaneously. Technology on Roshar is ever evolving, and every year more and more breakthroughs are being made that makes the world smaller and the lives of everyday people easier. However, these modern innovations pale in comparison to the magical wonders of Roshar's ancient past, remnants of which are still found in societies across the planet to this day. Soulcasters are a type of ancient fabrial capable of altering the state of matter itself. The advantages even a single soulcaster can provide are immense. For example, on a construction site, a soulcaster that transmutes sand into stone can accomplish more in a day than 100 manual labourers would in a week. Perhaps the most important form of soulcaster are those which transform stone into grain, capable of producing infinite food, so long as they can be consistently supplied with gemstones to power them. The process of creating soulcasters has been lost to the ages, and try as they might, modern scholars have been unable to recreate them. The Vorin Church teaches that soulcasters were created in the long-lost Shadow Days, and were one of the Almighty's gifts to humanity during the Wars of Desolation against the Voidbringers. Incidentally, this is also what the Church says about by far the most culturally influential yet utterly destructive remnant of those bygone days. In many ways, power, war and politics in Roshar revolve around the possession of shard blades and shard plate. According to Vorin legend, shard blades were first carried by the Knights Radiant uncounted ages ago in their wars against the demonic Voidbringers. Shard blades cut effortlessly through inanimate material, gliding through rock and steel as effortlessly as a hot knife through butter. When a shard blade passes through a living person, it does not physically tear open that person's flesh, but severs his life force. If a shard blade passes through a limb, that limb will never move again. If a shard blade touches a man's spine, he dies instantly, his eyes burning up and shriveling into coals. Normal armor is useless against a shard blade. Indeed, the only thing which can protect a man from the weapons of the Lost Radiance is the armor of the Lost Radiance, shard plate. On a Rosharan battlefield, a shard bearer equipped with both blade and plate is practically an invincible weapon of mass destruction, capable of cutting down hundreds if not thousands of normal soldiers with ease, only counterable by another shard bearer. As such, throughout the continent, a nation's power and political prestige are directly linked to how many shards it owns. When the Knights Radiant still watched over the land, these marvels were commonplace. However, in the current age, they have become exceptionally rare. Over the centuries, monarchs have traded palaces, cities, and even entire kingdoms in exchange for them. It is unclear how many sets of shard plate remain on Roshar today, but there are only around 100 shard blades. Of these, the kingdoms of Alethkar and Jakaved own the most, at around 20 apiece. The Thaylens possess 5 shard blades, which they keep in the hands of their royal guard, while the Hadazians have 1 passed down through their royal family. In the west, shard blades are more rare. The Azish Empire possesses only a handful, which they loan out to their client states, while the Iriali, like the Hadazians, possess only 1. In the year 1169, King Gavilar of Alethkar went on a hunting trip east, into the sparsely inhabited and largely unexplored hills near the origins of the storms. There he discovered something remarkable, a hitherto unknown tribe of non-human peoples with pitch-black eyes and marbled skin of red-white and red-black. They looked very much like the meek, mindless Parshmen who served as slaves throughout Alethkar. But unlike them, this tribe was intelligent, armed with their own weapons, and possessed of their own language and culture. Utterly fascinated by these Parshendi, these Parshmen who can think, King Gavilar forged an alliance with them and invited them to attend a feast in his royal palace of Kholinar. Unbeknownst to him, the events of that feast would trigger a chain of events that rocked Alethkar to its core and put all of Roshar in peril. We will begin our story today not on the planet of Roshar, but at the very beginning of the universe as we know it. Indeed, the events of the Stormlight Archive are inextricably tied to the Cosmere, the vast transplanetary shared universe in which the world of the Stormlight Archive exists alongside the worlds of all of Brandon's other fantasy novels, such as Elantris, Mistborn, Warbreaker, and so on. Incidentally, we have already published a comprehensive guide to the Cosmere on this channel, which we recommend you check out as a supplement to this video. Although much has yet to be revealed of the inner workings of the Cosmere, we know that it was created by an entity known as Adonalsium, who, for all intents and purposes, was God. Moreover, we know that before the Cosmere came to exist in its current form, a group of 16 mortals came together and conspired to destroy God. These mortals succeeded, and Adonalsium was murdered. Upon his death, the power of Adonalsium was sundered into 16 shards, each one an aspect of his personality. These shards were devotion, dominion, preservation, ruin, odium, cultivation, honor, endowment, autonomy, ambition, invention, mercy, valor, whimsy, and virtuosity. As of the publishing of this video, the identity of the 16th is unknown. Each of the god's 16 mortal murderers claimed one of the shards, becoming known as shard holders, and coming to possess a fragment of divinity. Although Adonalsium's murders had once all had their own unique personalities, the power of divinity overwhelmed them, and they became overcome by an overpowering desire to follow the intent of their individual shards. In short, the 16 had killed their deity, and in so doing had become gods themselves, albeit ones arguably stripped of their mortal identity and completely bound by the personality of the shard they had claimed. After the shattering, the shard holders scattered, either creating their own planets, or settling on planets Adonalsium had created before his murder. Wherever a shard settled, they brought with them massive amounts of investiture, the spiritual energy which empowers all of the Cosmere's forms of magic. Indeed, each of the worlds which came to be inhabited by a shard developed magic systems powered by investiture, with the form and nature of their magic determined by the influence of the shard holder on that world. Throughout the Cosmere, myriad civilizations came to thrive upon myriad planets, whose people came to worship their resident shard holders as gods. Initially, these inhabited planets had no interaction with one another, for the shard holders had formed a pact to never commingle and leave one another to their individual spheres of influence. However, that agreement was never going to last, for while some shard holders had inherited the more peaceful aspects of Adonalsium's personality, and had a mandate to ensure growth and stability within their individual pockets of the Cosmere, some shard holders had inherited the more violent and passionate aspects of the murdered god, and were thus compelled by intent to disrupt the peace. It would be this inevitable clash between the living shards of a dead god that would ultimately become the main source of conflict in the Stormlight Archive. But before we get into that, let us talk about the origins of the main planet the series takes place on, the wind-swept, storm-battered and creme-caked plains of Roshar. The planet of Roshar predates the shattering of Adonalsium, and was created countless millennia ago by the moribund god before his murder at the hands of the 16. Even in that impossibly primordial age, the landscape of Roshar would have probably been more or less recognizable to anyone who lived on the planet during the events of the Stormlight Archive series. Much like it is in the present, prehistoric Roshar was shaped by high storms, massive, destructive, world-spanning hurricanes that ravaged the planet's surface from east to west once every few days. This resulted in Roshar's bizarre and alien-esque biosphere, which featured vast swathes of land without topsoil, dominated by retractable trees, sturdy rock buds, skittering cremlings, lumbering great shells, and many other species of flora and fauna with shells thick enough to withstand the high storm winds, or other evolutionary functions capable of shielding themselves from the gale. Indeed, perhaps the only prominent part of Roshar's modern ecosystem, which did not exist at the time of the planet's genesis, was the race of humanity, but more on that shortly. Prehistoric Roshar was also home to the spren, fey-like creatures native to another layer of reality known as the cognitive realm, or Shadesmar, but capable of manifesting into the physical realm in hollow ethereal forms. The spren of this era were mindless beings, no more self-aware than the base concepts they embodied. However, they were capable of forming symbiotic relationships with Roshar's native wildlife. By allowing a spren into their gem heart, a life-giving gemstone found inside the anatomy of most of the planet's indigenous species, various Rosharan animals received various benefits. For example, by bonding with spren, the huge hardened carapaces of creatures like chasm fiends were made lighter, allowing them to grow to otherwise impossibly large sizes. Perhaps the most versatile of bonds that existed in this period was between Spren and Roshar's indigenous sapient humanoid species, the Singers. At the beginning of the Stormlight Archive, the Singers, known to humanity as the Parshmen, are a docile slave race, barely capable of speech and independent thought. However, deep in the mists of prehistory, this was not the case. Before the arrival of humanity on Roshar, the Singers were a vibrant, intelligent race, with many songs to sing. Humanoid, but not quite human, the Singers were a crab-like people, with marbled skin of swirling whites, reds and blacks. Like most species indigenous to Roshar, parts of their body were covered in hardened carapace. The Singers' name came from the fact that, unlike humanity, whose languages are expressed through phonetics, the Singers communicated with one another primarily through sophisticated musical rhythms. Moreover, like other native Rosharan species, the Singers possessed gem hearts, which they could allow Spren into to form bonds with. Although the so-called Parshmen of modern Roshar have only one form, slave form, their ancestors were capable of forging bonds with different types of Spren. In so doing, the Singers transformed into different forms, such as work form, mate form, nimble form, and war form, each one slightly altering their morphology to specialize them for a specific aspect of life. Sometime during this primordial era of Rosharan history, the landscape of the planet was enriched by the arrival of two shards of Adonalsium, Honor and Cultivation. The two shards harmonized well together, for both of them had peaceful intents. Honor's intent made him a being of order, committed to upholding oaths, agreements, and the natural laws of the universe. Cultivation's intent made her a being of transformation, committed to the growth of things and people. Like every other world created or settled by a shard of Adonalsium, the arrival of Honor and Cultivation on Roshar infused the planet with massive amounts of investiture, the energy which powers all magic in the Cosmere, and this resulted in profound changes to the tapestry of life on the planet. As a result of their influence, new species of intelligent Spren began appearing, both in Shadesmar and the physical realm. These Spren were fully sapient, and capable of both speech and critical thinking, and likely forged strong bonds of friendship with the Singers. Some of these thinking Spren were many in number, such as the Honor Spren, Cultivation Spren, Ink Spren, Reachers, and Cryptics. Others, however, were one of a kind. One such unique Spren was the Stormfather, the physical manifestation of the High Storm given sentience by Honor. By elevating the Stormfather, Honor transformed the High Storms into a manifestation of his power, with Stormlight, a gaseous form of Honor's investiture, blanketing and enriching the planet's surface with every world-shaking hurricane. Before long, the Singers had come to worship Honor and Cultivation as their gods, and under their gods' guidance, the Singers likely achieved a highly advanced civilization during this time, building prosperous cities which rivaled anything that humans would build in later millennia. However, this golden era of Roshar was not to last, for soon new arrivals would come upon the windswept planet, bearing with them a new god. They came from another world, using powers that we have been forbidden to touch, dangerous powers of spren and surges. They destroyed their lands and have come to us begging. We took them in, as commanded by the gods. What else could we do? They were a people forlorn, without a home. Our pity destroyed us, for their betrayal extended even to our gods, to spren, stone and wind. Beware the otherworlders, the traitors, those with tongues of sweetness, but with minds that lust for blood. Do not take them in, do not give them succor. Well were they named Voidbringers, for they brought the void, the empty pit that sucks in emotion, a new god, their god. These Voidbringers know no songs, they cannot hear Roshar, and where they go, they bring silence. They look soft, with no shell, but they are hard. They have but one heart, and it cannot ever live. The Ilia Stele. While Honor and Cultivation were putting their roots down in Roshar, a third shard of Adonalsium was tearing a path of destruction throughout the Cosmere. This was Odium, the shard of fury, contempt, and raw untempered emotion. As the shard holders dispersed after the shattering of Adonalsium and created their own planetary spheres of influence, Odium refused to invest in any world, and instead set out on a cosmic mission to search for and destroy his once companions. The first victims of Odium's interstellar manhunt were the shards of Devotion and Dominion, located on the planet of Sel. where the novels of Elantris and the Emperor's Soul take place. Odium killed Devotion and Dominion, but much like with Adonalsium, these fragments of God were not destroyed entirely but splintered, their investiture fragmented across their world in ways that still impact the planet of Sel to this day. Odium next travelled to the planet of Threnody, where the Shard Ambition was invested. Odium attacked Ambition, and after a vicious, world-shaking fight, managed to splinter her as well. The sheer volume of investiture thrown about between Odium and Ambition's fatal struggle tore Threnody apart, and to this day, the planet remains a dark, twisted place, mangled by the interdimensional scars of two warring gods. After killing Ambition, Odium travelled to Ashin, the first planet from the Sun in the Rosharan system and a neighbour to the planet of Roshar itself. Unlike the bizarre alien landscape of Roshar, the biosphere of Ashin was largely Earth-like, featuring green fields of grass and animals like birds and horses. Ashin was home to a native population of humans, and upon Odium's arrival upon their planet, these humans began to worship the Shard of Untempered Passion as their god. At some point, Odium began empowering the humans of Ashin with his investiture, and teaching them a form of magic known as the Surges, dangerous powers capable of tampering with the very fabric of creation. Eventually, the rampant and unregulated use of the Surges triggered a planetary cataclysm which destroyed Ashin, engulfing the vast majority of its surface in flames. In the modern Vorin religion of Roshar, the planet of Ashin is remembered as the Tranquiline Halls, the paradise that awaits all virtuous men and women in the afterlife. Very few among Roshar's modern human populations are aware that their species is not native to Roshar, and that the Tranquiline Halls are not heaven, but their original homeworld. Indeed, with their planet rendered uninhabitable, the humans of Ashin embarked on a mass exodus, using the very same surges that had destroyed their planet to now flee its surface and travel to the nearest inhabitable world, which happened to be the neighbouring planet of Roshar. Humanity first arrived on the storm-swept plains of Roshar around 7,000 years before the events of the Stormlight Archive series. Naturally, they quickly encountered the native singers, who were commanded by honor and cultivation to take in the refugees and give them a new home. The singers had no choice but to obey their gods, but there was a major issue. Humanity was an alien species on Roshar, completely ill-suited to life on the planet. Humans were soft, squishy creatures with no shell or protective carapace to speak of, and the same was true of their livestock they had brought with them. Cows, pigs, horses and chickens were large, soft-skinned mammals, which lacked the protective carapace necessary to withstand the brutal high storms. Fortunately, there was one region of Roshar that was suitable for human habitation, the western edge of the planet's mega-continent, a region now known as Shinovar. Separated from the rest of the continent by a huge mountain range, which served as a massive windbreak, Shinovar was the only place on the great Rosharan landmass largely unaffected by the high storms. Thus, the human refugees were given Shinovar as their new homeland, and for a time it seems as if they assimilated peacefully into their new home and developed amiable relations with the indigenous singers. However, this was not to last. For when the humans of Ashin arrived upon Roshar, they had also brought with them their god, Odium, and wherever Odium went, chaos and discord was sure to follow. Indeed, Odium had come to the Rosharan system for one reason: to murder honor and cultivation, in the same way he had murdered devotion, dominion and ambition. It is very possible that he purposefully orchestrated the destruction of Ashin and the exodus of humanity to Roshar to help further this insidious goal. Shortly after settling in Shinovar, the humans decided that they were not satisfied with what they had been given, and launched a violent invasion of the rest of the Rosharan continent. Within a generation, they had overrun the planet, and pushed the indigenous singers to the fringes of their own ancestral homelands. It is unknown what exactly compelled the humans to do this, but it is almost certain that Odium was crucial in the breakdown of relations between humanity and the singers. To the singers, this was the ultimate betrayal. They had given humanity a new home, only to be turned upon. Among the singers, the human invasion of Roshar became known as the First Desolation, and was forever immortalized in the collective trauma of their species. Consequently, humankind became known as the Voidbringers, for humanity knew no songs. Humanity was alien to Roshar and could not hear the rhythms of the planet, and wherever humanity went, only silence followed. Thus, the hidden truth behind the mythologies of the Vorin Church is revealed. The origin of the Voidbringers, the otherworldly demons in Vorin scripture who caused an endless cycle of apocalyptic wars in Roshar's ancient past, were none other than humanity. The First Desolation would not be the end of the story. Humanity had dealt the first blow, but the Singers would strike back and fight to reclaim their planet. All the while, the shards of Honor, Cultivation and Odium would pick their sides, and the war fought between the two mortal species for the fate of a planet would quickly evolve into a war fought between the immortal fragments of a dead creation deity with the entire Cosmere hanging in the balance. As humans and Singers fought one another with the passion of fury and betrayal in their hearts, Odium must have watched on with malicious glee. Yet his counterpart, Honor, did not sit idly by as the vengeful interloper wrought chaos upon the planet he and Cultivation had invested in. Using his powers as the god of oaths and pacts, Honor imprisoned Odium upon Braze, a barren, lifeless rock of a planet which neighboured Roshar as the third planet from the sun in the Rosharan system. Among the modern Vorin peoples of Roshar, Braze is remembered as Damnation, their religion's version of hell. Honor's decision to seal a being intent on his destruction in the same star system as himself may seem counterproductive, but it must be remembered that Odium's terrible ambitions extended beyond the Rosharan system. Thus, by sealing Odium in the same system as him, Honor was making a personal sacrifice. He and the peoples of Roshar would keep Odium's fury contained, and in so doing, protect the rest of the Cosmere. Early on during the First Desolation, an incredibly peculiar thing happened. The warring gods switched sides, with Odium abandoning humanity and becoming patron to the Singers, and Honor and Cultivation abandoning the Singers and siding with mankind. As of the fourth book in the Stormlight Archive series, it is unknown why this happened. Whatever the reason, from that point on, Honor became the principal god of mankind, and Odium became the supreme overlord of the Singers. Cultivation, meanwhile, melted into the sidelines, taking a background role in the escalating planetary conflict. Despite being stuck on Braze, Odium was still capable of infusing some of his investiture on Roshar and enhancing his followers with his powers. While Honor's investiture on Roshar manifested as the gaseous white-blue stormlight that blew across the land with every high storm, Odium's investiture infested the planet as red-violet voidlight. It was through infusing certain Singers with voidlight that Odium created the Fused. The Fused were Singers given immortality by the god of passion. Drawn from among the greatest warriors, kings, priests and heroes among Singer kind, these once mortal people of Roshar were transformed into formless beings, not unlike the ethereal spren of the cognitive realm. In becoming undying, the Fused gave up their original bodies, but were given the ability to possess the bodies of mortal Singers, a process which always killed the host. The Fused could be struck down in battle, but never permanently killed. Whenever their vessels were slain by arrow, sword or spear, their cognitive spirit simply zipped out from the moribund body as a stream of ghostly voidlight and possessed another mortal Singer, being reborn anew. On top of being effectively unkillable, Odium also granted the Fused the use of Surges, the very same magics he had once taught the humans of Ashin, which had led to the destruction of their world. The Fused were a game changer. Possessed of awesome powers, no normal human soldier could stand before them. They tore through shield walls, melted infantry blocks, and destroyed entire towns and cities with ease. On the off chance they were killed, they were simply reborn in the nearest Singer foot soldier, their powers instantly reawakened in their new host. Through Odium's influence, humanity had begun a war to conquer Roshar from the Singers. Now, thanks to that same pandemoniac god, the war was tipped heavily back in the Singers' favour. Humankind could never hope to win when faced with creatures who were reborn each time they were slain. Yet despite their dire straits, Honor still lived in the hearts of men, and so the humans and their god conceived of a solution known as the Oathpact. The Oathpact was a magical vow sworn between Honor and 10 humans, 5 men and 5 women, who represented the greatest judges, scholars, kings and generals among their race. These fateful 10 became known as the Heralds, and through their connection to honor were elevated to immortality. Moreover, each herald was given an honor blade, an indestructible sword, which gave its user access to the surges formed from a piece of honor's very soul. The leader of the heralds was Jezrien, the Herald of Kings. By his side was Nael, the Herald of Justice, Chanarach, the Herald of Obedience, Vedel, Herald of Healing, Pylaia, Herald of Learning, Shalash, Herald of Beauty, Batar, Herald of Wisdom, and Kalak, the Herald of Building. In terms of raw investiture, the most powerful of the heralds was Ishar, the Herald of Luck and Binder of Gods. Last among the 10 was Talanel, Herald of War. The Oathpact was initially designed as a final act of self-sacrifice. Through honor's power of oaths, the heralds were given the ability to banish the fused to Braze, the prison planet upon which Odium himself was imprisoned. This would, in effect, end the threat the fused posed to humanity, but there was a catch. In order to keep the fused sealed upon Braze, the heralds would need to imprison themselves on that selfsame lifeless planet. Only by going into exile into damnation could they keep mankind's undying enemies sealed away. Thus the heralds travelled to Braze, and in so doing, imprisoned the fused there. However, there was a second catch, one that neither the heralds nor Honor himself had foreseen. The Oathpact only held as long as all 10 heralds willingly agreed to stay in exile on Braze. If any one of them broke their oath and returned to Roshar, Honor's sealing magic would fail, and the fused would be free also to return to Roshar and continue their assault on mankind. Upon learning this, the imprisoned fused on Braze began hunting down the heralds. The heralds naturally fought back, but they were only 10, and the fused were hundreds. Inevitably, the heralds were captured and subjected to horrific torture until one of them broke, agreeing to return to Roshar and free the fused from their prison. Each time the heralds broke, they returned to lead mankind against the fused, and after guiding humanity to victory against the fused on Roshar, they would return to Braze to seal the enemy again. If a herald died in battle, they would be automatically resurrected on Braze in a reincarnation process which, unlike the fused, did not require the possession of a mortal body to occur. Every time they returned to the prison planet, be it willingly or by death in battle, the heralds were immediately captured and tortured by the fused, and each time one of them would break once more. Thus, the Desolations became something of a cycle, an endless, seemingly never-ending pattern of apocalyptic wars which the Oathpact could stall, but due to the human fallibility of the heralds, never permanently end. With that said, the heralds were capable of enduring torture for up to centuries at a time, therefore providing humanity with generations worth of time to rebuild their societies between desolations. Indeed, in the time between desolations, humanity evidently managed to push the Singers to the fringes of the Rosharan landmass and form 10 kingdoms, known as the Silver Kingdoms, which came to dominate the planet's supercontinent. However, it was always only a matter of time until one of the heralds inevitably broke and unleashed the fused back on Roshar, triggering a new desolation. Even with the heralds leading them, human society was practically reduced back to the Stone Age after every desolation, for the heralds were only 10 and the fused were many. Thus, a new caste of champions arose among the ranks of mankind to even out the field, champions known as the Knights Radiant. At some point during the Desolations, the intelligent spren of Roshar decided to side with humanity against the Singers. This decision was seen as a huge betrayal by the Singers, who had been friends with the spren prior to humankind's usurpation of their planet. However, the spren of Roshar were born of honor and cultivation's investiture, and Singers had embraced Odium's corruptive voidlight. So it was that the intelligent spren of Roshar began infusing themselves with humans through a process known as a Nahel bond. The process was similar to how their cousins, the mindless spren, had formed bonds with Roshar's indigenous wildlife and the Singers since time immemorial. The difference was that humans bonding with spren did not change their form as Singers did, but were granted the power of the Surges. Indeed, as beings of honor, the spren were capable of mimicking aspects of honor's Oathpact and giving their human hosts similar powers to the heralds, albeit not at as potent a level as the heralds themselves. The Nahel bond was symbiotic, for the intelligent spren were native to the cognitive realm, and were normally incapable of passing into the physical world without becoming mindless. By bonding with humans, they could enter the physical realm and maintain their sense of self. 10 species of spren developed the ability to form Nahel bonds with humans, each one mimicking the power of one of the Heralds. The result was 10 distinct orders of Knights Radiant, each one formed of humans bonded with a distinct type of spren. Each order had access to 2 types of surge binding, with each surge possessed by 2 different orders, but no orders having the same 2 surges. While we do not have time to list all 10 orders and their powers, we will go over the ones that feature most prominently in the Stormlight Archive series. Perhaps the most iconic order of the Knights Radiant was the Order of Windrunners, who, bonded with Honor Spren, mimicked the powers of the Herald Jezrien, and were given access to the surges of adhesion and gravitation. This allowed them to stick objects together or alter their gravitational pull, which in a roundabout way allowed them to fly. Windrunners often served as the vanguard on the battlefield. In contrast, the Edge Dancers, who bonded with Cultivation Spren and mimicked the powers of the Herald Vedel, served as its infiltrators. The Edge Dancers had access to the Surge of Abrasion, which was used to manipulate the frictional force between 2 surfaces, allowing them to glide across war zones as effortlessly as a figure skater over ice. They also had access to the Surge of Progression, which gave them healing powers. Many orders of the Knights Radiant were oriented around soldiery, but not all. One example of a primarily non-combat order were the Lightweavers, who bonded with Cryptics and mimicked the powers of the Herald Shalash. The Lightweavers possessed the surges of Illumination and Transformation, which allowed them to create auditory and visual illusions, as well as change their appearance, making them ideal spies and secret agents. The powers of the Knights Radiant existed on a progression system that followed a tiered system of magic oaths known as ideals or immortal words, which when spoken would strengthen the Nahel bond between a Radiant and their spren. Each order had a different set of immortal words, but all of them shared the same first ideal: life before death, strength before weakness, journey before destination. As Radiants progressed to a point where they spoke their second, third, and fourth ideals, their spren gained the ability to transform into a shard blade and pull lesser spren from the cognitive realm and form them into shard plate. However, attaining the ideals was not as simple as speaking the words. If a Radiant spoke their oaths without meaning them, nothing would happen. Only when a Radiant was truly ready to uphold the principles of their order would their Nahel bond strengthen. This system effectively served as a limitation upon the raw power of surge binding. For surge binding had once destroyed a planet, and thus Honor and the Spren ensured that humankind would only ever use such powers with magical checks and safeguards in place. The supernatural abilities of the Knights Radiant were powered directly by Honor's investiture, which was most easily obtainable in the form of Stormlight. Knights Radiant could absorb Stormlight directly by standing in high storms, or far more safely, by simply sucking it out of Stormlight-infused gemstones. Without Stormlight, a Radiant's powers barely worked, but when infused with Stormlight, a Radiant was practically invulnerable. The Stormlight in their bodies gave them powerful regenerative properties that allowed them to recover from all but the most mortal of wounds. A Stormlight-infused Radiant was even capable of regrowing severed limbs. At some point between desolations, the Knights Radiant congregated to build a home base for themselves, a tower city, which they gave the sacred palindromic name of Urithiru. This massive spire was nestled deep in the treacherous mountains of Ur, and accessible only by flight or by Oathgate, teleportation devices located in the capital of each of the Silver Kingdoms, powered by spren with access to the surge of transportation. As for the 10 Heralds, although they were initially hesitant to acknowledge the Radiants who had mimicked their powers, they soon came to embrace them and became the leaders of their corresponding orders. Thus, from its construction onwards, Urithiru became humanity's main base, a place from where the Heralds and their Knights Radiant led the charge against the forces of Odium whenever a desolation occurred. However, even with the Heralds and the Knights Radiant serving as the shield of mankind, each desolation was still a brutal, cataclysmic, and hard-won affair. The Fused, after all, remained incredibly formidable opponents, something of a mirror image to the Radiants. There were 9 types of Fused, each of which had powers which roughly correspond to those of an Order of Radiance. For example, the Shanaim or Heavenly Ones had access to the surge of gravitation, and thus often dueled the Windrunners in the skies in a deadly cosmic ballet. Meanwhile, the Shetelim or Flowing Ones controlled the surge of abrasion and glided toe-for-toe against the speedy Edgerunners. Moreover, Odium's armies consisted of far more than just the Fused. Just like Honor and Cultivation's investiture had resulted in the creation of intelligent spren, so too did Odium's investiture do the same. While spren born of Honor and Cultivation sided with humanity and helped create the Knights Radiant, spren born of Odium, known as Void Spren, helped empower the Singers. By infusing themselves in a Singer's gemstone, they were able to grant a Singer forms of power which enhanced their strength and speed, and allowed them to shoot lightning out of their fingertips. Singers bonded to Void Spren were known as Regals, and while they weren't as powerful or held in as high esteem as the Fused, they were still incredibly dangerous opponents. Beyond Fused and Regals, the forces of Odium could also call upon Juggernauts, known as the Thunderclasts, giant stone monsters that stood as tall as hills, impervious to all weapons, except a Radiance Shardblade. At the lowest tier of Odium's army were the normal Singers. They were standard, mortal beings who served mostly as expendable infantry under the command of the Fused. Indeed, as much as humanity suffered under Odium's wrath, the Singers suffered harder. Their fight to reclaim their planet from the human colonizers appropriated by the god of passion, who utilized their rage to turn them into disposable bodies for his army. Like the Fused, Void Spren and Thunderclasts were sealed on braes after each desolation, only to return at the beginning of the next. As the desolations continued, they settled into a predictable yet devastating form of tiered warfare, in which blocks of mundane human and Singer soldiers clashed against one another upon barren, storm-swept plains, while beings infused with the investiture of Honor and Odium soared above and around them, streaks of Stormlight and Voidlight entwining in testament to the seemingly endless conflict of gods and men. Over time, humanity came to refer to the apocalyptic, cyclically returning armies of Odium as the Voidbringers, co-opting the very name the Singers had used to refer to humanity when humanity had first betrayed Singer kind. However, it should be noted that while much information on the Desolations has been lost by the modern age, that the reality on the ground was not a binary struggle between humans and Singers. The modern Hadazian and Unkalaki peoples of Roshar are both human races with a substrate of ancient Singer ancestry, and are proof of the fact that cohabitation between Singers and mankind must have occurred during the heraldic epochs, between the cycle of wars driving the two species apart. Moreover, while most Singers rallied behind Odium in his war against Honor and mankind, not all did. Towards the end of the Desolations, a group of regal Singers, known as the Last Legion, deserted the armies of the Fused, forswore Odium as their god, and fled to the remote Far East. There they gave up all their forms of power, and reduced themselves only to dull form. This was the ultimate sacrifice for liberation, for by giving up their Voidlight-powered forms, the Singers of the Last Legion were reduced to slow, nearly mindless beings, but it freed them from Odium's grasp. When the Oathpact was first formed around 7,000 years ago, the Heralds were possessed of immense mental fortitude, able to endure the torture of the Fused for centuries at a time, and in so doing, giving humanity many generations to rebuild between each desolation. However, it was only a matter of time before the countless lifetimes worth of torture took their toll. By 2 millennia after the founding of the Oathpact, the time between desolations had gradually shrunk from centuries to decades. Soon the desolations were separated by fewer than 10 years. Each desolation scoured mankind, wiping out any cities they had built, technology they had developed, and claiming a death toll as high as 90% of the population of entire kingdoms. Now, as the resolve of the Heralds wavered, humanity was left with practically no time at all to rebuild and recover from the severe depopulation and near Stone Age state that each desolation left them in. Thus, our story arrives at an event remembered by the modern Vorin religion as Aharietiam, the Last Desolation. A misnomer, for Aharietiam was a desolation like any other, with only one difference. After defeating the Fused on Roshar, 9 Heralds had survived, with only one having died in battle, and thereby sent back to Braze. One by one, the surviving Heralds realized that the one returned Herald happened to be the only one who, in the millennia since the founding of the Oathpact, had never broke under the Fused's torture: Thaylen, the Herald of War. The surviving 9 heralds came together and made a decision to abandon the Oathpact forever and allow the 10th among them, Thaylen, to endure torture on Braze alone. So it was that the immortal leaders of humanity announced to the Knights Radiant and all of humanity that the final desolation had occurred and the cycle was broken. This was a lie, of course, but one that, perhaps to the Herald's own surprise, became the truth. For indeed, alone in damnation, the 10th abandoned Herald endured the torture of the Fused alone and never broke. For 4,500 years, Thaylen kept the forces of Odium at bay at the cost of endless torment to himself. By abandoning him to suffer alone, the Heralds had actually broken the Cycle of Desolations, at least for now. Contrary to the teachings of the modern Vorin Church, the Heralds did not part ways with humanity to drive the Voidbringers out of the Tranquiline Halls after the last desolation. Instead, they simply walked away, abandoning the Oathpact and hoping that everything would work itself out. They remained on Roshar incognito, keeping their identities hidden so none would know the last desolation was a lie. Once, the Heralds had been noble, compassionate and regal men and women, but due to a combination of the trauma of thousands of years of torture and the fact they had all lived far past their natural lifespan, their sanity began to deteriorate. By the time that the Stormlight Archive begins, the Heralds had become shadows of their former selves, overcome by paranoia and substance abuse. Nevertheless, although unseen, the Heralds would remain among Roshar for the next thousands of years, and influence the development of the planet in various subtle ways. All the while, Thaylen, the strongest among them, remained on damnation, single-handedly upholding the Oathpact and keeping the Voidbringers at bay. Indeed, the 10th Herald refused to break to torture. Thus, the large majority of Odium's armies, including the Fused, the Thunderclasts and the Void Spren, remained sealed on the planet of Braze, where they would remain for the next 4,500 years after the last desolation. However, that did not mean that Odium's influence was entirely gone from Roshar. It is here that we must introduce the Unmade into our story. The Unmade is a collective term for 9 primordial spren native to Roshar and likely as old as the planet itself. While vastly different in their manner of manifestations, they all have one thing in common. At some point, they were discovered by Odium and altered into becoming his minions. It is unknown what this process entailed, only that it involved their unmaking, hence their name. Some of the Unmade are at least somewhat self-aware, such as Ba'ada Mishram, Rishepir, Sha'anat, and Yelik-Nar. Others, such as Nogaul and Ashurtman, are mere creatures of instinct, closer to lesser spren than intelligent spren. In any case, all of the Unmade were supremely powerful entities, with the ability to influence and twist the minds of men. During the Desolations, they all served Odium, aiding the armies of the Fused against the Heralds and the Knights Radiant. Unlike the rest of Odium's magically enhanced minions, the Unmade were not bound by the Oathpact, and continued to sow chaos on the planet even as their master and most of his minions remained indefinitely imprisoned away. After the last desolation, humanity was now the dominant species on Roshar. However, the Singers persisted on, continuing to fight for the ancestral lands which had been stolen from their ancestors by mankind. Yet, with the Fused and the Void Spren sealed away, the Singers no longer had access to forms of power, and thus were no longer able to stand up to surges of honor. It is likely that during this era, Roshar's indigenous species went into a steep decline, pushed once more to the fringes of their native planet by the soft-skinned, toneless interlopers their ancestors had called Voidbringers. Deprived of their god, and growing in their desperation, the Singers turned to the last remnants of Odium's power on Roshar for their salvation. Around 2,500 years after the last desolation, and 2,000 years prior to the beginning of the Stormlight Archive, the unmade Ba'ado Mishram somehow managed to connect herself to the Singers, infusing them with voidlight and granting them forms of power. Now enhanced with the mighty abilities of forms like Stormform, Direform, Smokeform, and Nightform, the Singers launched a massive renewed offensive on humanity. This war is remembered in the Vorin teachings as the First Desolation. So little is known about this conflict that the modern Vorin Church debates on whether or not it even happened. but happen it did. The False Desolation was so named because, unlike the Desolations of old, it was not led by the immortal fused, who were still stuck on Braze, but by mortal singers, temporarily enhanced by Voidlight. The orders of the Knights Radiant rose up against this new threat, but it is likely that, even without their fused masters, the singers empowered by Ba-Addo-Mishram posed an extreme threat, and brought several of the ancient Silver Kingdoms to their knees. As the False Desolation raged on, the Knights Radiant eventually discovered the source of the singers' power, and formed an elite strike team whose mission was to imprison Ba-Addo-Mishram. The vessel for the Unmaid's imprisonment would be a perfect gem, for only a flawless stone was capable of holding Stormlight or Voidlight without any leakage, and thus capable of imprisoning an extremely powerful entity born of Odium's Voidlight. The Radiant's mission was a triumph, and they successfully managed to track down and seal away the fiend behind the Singers' empowerment. Yet the cost for their victory was devastating. Rather than simply reduce the Singers back to normalcy, as the Radiants expected would happen, the true repercussions were far, far worse. Since Ba-Addo-Mishram was connected to the vast majority of Singers, her imprisonment ripped out connection and identity from the Singers' souls, effectively lobotomizing them. The Singers lost all their forms except for slave form, in which they lost nearly all their higher functions, the ability for complex thought and speech, and most importantly, all of their songs. Now completely helpless, the Singers were reduced to a slave caste, forced to serve in the most menial roles in human society, and treated as breedable chattel by mankind. Over the generations, the origins and the very names of the Singers were lost. They became known as the Parshmen, and by the time of the Stormlight Archive, the races of man had come to take their slaves for granted, having long forgotten that the Parshmen were the true native peoples of Roshar, and were once part of the so-called Voidbringer armies that terrorized humanity's ancient ancestors during the Desolations of old. There was, however, one group of singers that avoided this fate. They were the Last Legion, the group of singers who had abandoned Odium before the Last Desolation, given up their forms of power, and fled into the uncharted eastern wastelands. As the Last Legion had severed their ties to Odium, so too did they reject Ba-Addo-Mishram and refuse to join in the False Desolation. Thus they were spared lobotomization when the Unmade was imprisoned. For the next 2,000 years, the Last Legion, or Listeners as they came to call themselves, would focus on restoring their natural forms, the ones that did not rely on Odium's Voidlight. Hiding deep in the inaccessible east near the origins of the High Storm, humanity remained unaware of their existence. I remember at the end, Honor was more obsessed with oaths. There were times when the oath itself was more important than the meaning behind it. But he was not a passionless monster. He loved humankind. He died defending you. The Stormfather. The end of the False Desolation marked the high point of humanity's triumph. For the first time since their arrival in Roshar over 5,000 years before, they were the undisputed masters of the planet. However, the cost had been high, not just because of the countless generations lost to war, not just because of their heralds who had abandoned them, but because now they were about to lose their god. Indeed, Honor was dying. In truth, the Shard of Adonalsium had likely been slowly weakening for millennia, his power and life force bleeding away as he strained to keep Odium and his corrosive influence at bay. Knowing that his end was coming, Honor took measures to ensure that humanity would be protected and Odium would not triumph even after his demise. To that end, Honor poured much of his investiture into the Stormfather. Previously, the mighty spren of the High Storm had been more of a force than a person, but now he was elevated to sapience and semi-godhood and groomed to be Honor's successor. Moreover, Honor created a series of visions which depicted scenes of the Desolations of old. Each of these visions contained a warning of a true desolation. For Honor knew that one day the Oathpact would fail and Odium's forces would return, and he wanted to prepare humanity's best and brightest to unite in the face of this threat. Honor's visions were entrusted to the Stormfather, who was instructed to show them to a leader of man he deemed worthy when the time was right. With the Heralds in hiding and Honor fading, humanity had one tether remaining to their ancient past, the Knights Radiant, and before long they would lose them too. After the conclusion of the False Desolation, the Radiants were left shaken by what they had done to the Singers. They had assumed that imprisoning Ba'ad-o-Mishram would simply deprive the singers of their forms of power. The lobotomization and enslavement of an entire species had never been their intention. Wanting to better understand the powers they wielded, the Radiants began looking deep into the depths of their past and discovered a dark truth. By this point in history, it had been 5,000 years after the First Desolation, and humanity had long forgotten its origins. Yet by looking into the true nature of their surges, the Radiants discovered the truth. Not only was humanity from another planet, that planet had been destroyed by the very same powers the Radiants had been using for millennia. Rocked to their cores by this revelation, the Radiants turned to Honor for guidance. But by now, Honor's mind was mostly gone, and he offered only mad ramblings in his replies. Shortly after, Honor died, splintering into many shards, with the Stormfather living on as the largest portion of his remaining power. Despite Honor's demise, his Oathpact held, so long as the Herald Talonel continued to endure torture in damnation. Odium and his forces would still be held at bay, at least for now. We're spren, we're forces. You can't kill us completely, just sort of. You're the strange ones. Break a rock and it's still there. Break a spren and she's still there, sort of. Break a person and something leaves, something changes. What's left is just meat. You're weird. Sylphrena the Honor Spren. Now fully aware of the destructive capabilities of their powers, the Knights Radiant came together and made the fateful decision to sever their oaths and disband their orders. This choice was as necessary as it was tragic, for by abandoning their powers, the Radiants would be destroying their spren, sapient living people who they had developed a literally inseparable bond with. When a Radiant severed their Nahel bond, their spren died in a sense, becoming a creature known as a Deadeyes, a walking corpse with no self-awareness or capacity for communication, doomed to aimlessly wander Shadesmar for eternity. Importantly, however, the Radiant spren were not forced into this fate. Ultimately, after conferring with their bonded knights, they freely made the choice to lay down their lives so that the Ten Orders could walk away from their oaths. Thus, in an event now remembered by the Vorin Church as the Day of Recreance, the Knights Radiant laid down their shard blades, turned their backs on their sacred ideals, and officially disbanded. Thereafter, humanity lost its last link to the ancient era of the Desolations. The Recreance was an apocalypse for the civilizations of intelligent spren, transforming vast swathes of their populations into Deadeyes. The majority of the surviving spren were mere children at the time, and were forced to spend centuries without nurture and guidance. It would take some spren species several millennia to regain the society they had lost. It should also be noted that not all Radiant Orders went through with the Recreance. Rather than lay down their shard blades, the Order of Skybreakers went underground. Under the leadership of the incognito Herald Nali, they would continue operating in the shadows well into the time of the Stormlight Archive. With the Knights Radiant faded into history, the Planet of Storms was forever changed. It was in the centuries after the Recreance that the modern Rosharan society, seen at the beginning of the Stormlight Archive novels, began taking shape. With the Radiant's capital of Urithiru abandoned and the Oathgates left to ruin, the logistical system that had sustained the ancient world of shards and magic was no more, resulting in the collapse of the 10 ancient Silver Kingdoms. Over time, successor polities rose in their place, usually fragmented or diminished in territory compared to their successor kingdom. The Silver Kingdom of Thalath, for example, abandoned its continental territory and became the Merchant Kingdom of Thaylen. The Kingdom of Makabakam splintered into myriad successor states, the largest being the Empire of Azir. The Kingdom of Alethkar fractured into the Princedoms of Alethkar, 10 warlike fiefdoms perpetually skirmishing against one another for land and territory. Although commonplace during the ancient era of desolations, by the era of solitude, shard blades had become priceless and rare relics. Throughout Roshar, it was those who had laid claim to the abandoned shard blades and shard plate of the lost Radiants who became the kings and emperors of this new world order, and established long-lasting dynasties by passing said shards down their family line. Before long, all among the privileged few who wielded shard blades had forgotten their true nature. Shard blades weren't just provided to the Radiants by spren, they were spren. Back in times of Eld, when a Radiant had spoken the second ideal, their spren had gained the ability to morph into a spiritual weapon for their knights' use. Thus, the shardblades left on Roshar after the Recreance were, in essence, the corpses of once living people. As society continued to shift, the Vorin religion began to emerge throughout much of eastern Roshar. Society became gendered, with two-handed pursuits being relegated to men and one-handed pursuits being relegated to women. During the Desolations and the Heraldic epochs, men had written books and women had led armies into battle. Now, however, warfare became exclusive to men, while scholarship and literacy became the province of women. Moreover, in Vorin nations, a caste system developed. In the ancient past, a common side effect of Radiance who awoke their powers was that their eyes began to glow. Moreover, those who claimed the abandoned shardblades after the Recreance also experienced their eye colour changing. For this reason, people with bright eyes became associated with noble lineage and were elevated to the highest echelons of society, while those with darker eyes were relegated to its dregs. The increasing influence of the Vorin Church came to its logical conclusion some 1,400 years before the beginning of the Stormlight Archive, with the formation of the Hierocracy, a theocracy formed by the ardents of the Church, who seized political power from temporal rulers and formed a religious empire that came to engulf much of eastern Roshar. During the rule of the Hierocracy, much of Rosharan history was sanitized, with the Ardents pruning and purging the history books in order to cultivate a narrative that made it easier to control people. The notion that humanity were the original Voidbringers was lost to time, as was the true identity of their Parshmen slaves. Honor was rebranded as the Almighty, God of mankind, and the fact that he was dead was obscured until it was forgotten. The name of Odium, the god behind the Desolations, was also lost to time. Finally, while the lie that Aharietiam had been the final desolation was not invented by the Vorin Church, it was perpetuated by it. All of humanity was taught to believe that the Heralds had returned to the Tranquiline Halls and the Voidbringers were gone forever. Ultimately, the Hierocracy was short-lived, its downfall coming at the hands of an Alethi warlord known as Sadis the Sunmaker. Empowered by limitless ambition and the thrill of battle, the Sunmaker wielded the Shardblade, known as Oathbringer, to unite the 10 squabbling princedoms of Alethkar under his banner, the first ruler to do so since the days of the Silver Kingdoms. Sadis overthrew the Hierocracy, and although the Vorin Church would persist as a spiritual institution, it would never again wield political power over the Vorin nations of Roshar. With eastern Roshar subdued, the Sunmaker drove his armies westward, subduing the Makabaki lands of Azir and its client states. This conquest was so indiscriminately brutal that, to this day, the Alethi people are still looked upon as vicious, violent barbarians by the peoples of the West. It was perhaps for the best that the Sunmaker's empire collapsed immediately after his death, for he had named no heir, condemning his massive realm to collapse into infighting upon his demise. Thereafter, the Alethi retreated back into their original territories, fracturing back into 10 divided and squabbling princedoms. It would be many centuries before another warlord strong enough to unite them would arise, but that is a story for another time. The hatred that many nations harboured towards the Alethi continued long after the Sunmaker's death, exacerbated by the fact that later generations of Alethi came to revere the Sunmaker as a cultural hero despite his many atrocities. Because of this, and their continued belligerence with their neighbours, the Alethi developed a reputation among the other cultures of Roshar as warmongers and barbarians. Of course, this is not to say that the hands of other nations remained clean. It was simply that, unlike anyone else, the Alethi specifically elevated soldiery above all other professions as the highest profession a man could pursue, considering warfare to be the defining trait of their people. With that said, while the Alethi were warlike, they were not barbarians. Other than the scriptures of the Vorin Church, the most revered document in Alethkar were the Alethi Codes of War, an ancient military treatise which beseeched bright-eyed Alethi generals to persecute their wars with discipline, dignity, honesty, and honour. However, while factors like the codes mitigated the brutality of Alethi warmongering, there was also a side to the Alethi love for battle that was far darker than anyone could have ever conceived of. While Odium and his forces were still sealed away in damnation, the Unmade continued to carry out the God of Passion's will on Roshar. One Unmade who remained at large was Nergal, also known as the Thrill. Nogal was a mindless, incorporeal creature capable of seeping into the hearts of men and conditioning them to crave the titular thrill of violence like a drug. Ultimately, the Alethi people's love for war existed because of Nogal's influence, for Odium had sent the thrill to imbue the Alethi with an intergenerational addiction to combat, so that when the God of Discord escaped the bonds of Honor's magic and finally returned to Roshar with his Voidbringer hordes, there would be a battle-hardened army there already waiting for him and ready to receive of his passions. The only missing piece in Odium's plans to turn the Alethi people into his pawns was a champion, a brutal warlord who could bring the squabbling factions of Alethkar to heel under his boot. Soon he would have that too. "Don't you ever think about what it meant though?" Gavilar asked. "A kingdom? Something grander than yourself?" "That's foolish, Gavilar. When people fight, it's about the stuff. That's it." "Maybe," Gavilar said. "Maybe. There's something I want you to listen to. The codes of war from the old days, back when Alethkar meant something." Around 4,500 years after the last Desolation, 2,000 years after the Recreance, and 50 years before the beginning of the Stormlight Archive, two boys were born in the Alethi city of Kholinar. Their names were Gavilar Kholin and Dalinar Kholin. The two brothers were scions of the princely house of Kholin, albeit belonging only to a minor branch of the family. Despite their privileged pedigree, the two brothers were given few advantages in life. Having lost both their mother and father at a young age, they grew up having to fend for themselves. This rough upbringing tempered the two boys, moulding the older brother Gavilar into a cunning schemer and the younger brother Dalinar into a hardened fighter. Their strengths combined, the siblings rose above their station. By the time they had become young men, Gavilar had killed several of his extended relatives and seized the throne of the Kholin princedom, his brother having supported him the entire way. One of the biggest dreamers of his age, the newly coronated Prince Gavilar had ambitions that extended far beyond the horizons of the Kholin princedom. Gavilar's goal was to go above and beyond what the Sunmaker had achieved 500 years ago, to forge a true, united kingdom of Alethkar, one that would not collapse upon its founder's death as the Sunmaker's empire had, but would endure for 1,000 generations thereafter. While small-minded princes and greedy warlords pursued ephemeral gains such as shardblades, shardplate, and plunder, Gavilar set out to pursue an immortal legacy. Naturally, this was not a path that Gavilar would walk alone, for the ever-fierce and ever-loyal Dalinar would be there with him every step of the way. Thus, the brothers Kholin set forth on their warlike mission, descending upon the 9 other princedoms of Alethkar like a two-headed chasm fiend. Where Dalinar would be the vicious axe hound who would break the other Alethi princes on the battlefield, Gavilar would be the cunning statesman who engineered the political systems that would incorporate them into his new world order after their defeat. Although the two brothers shared the same goal, their motivations could not have been more different. While Gavilar was cold and calculating, Dalinar was hot-headed and vicious. Gavilar was a statesman who was driven by lofty goals of long-term nation-building, but Dalinar was cut from the cloth of the vicious Alethi warlords of old, desiring nothing but the glory of combat and unable to see further than the next big fight. Living deep in Dalinar's heart was a thrill for combat, a thrill that made him addicted to carnage and turned him into an unstoppable beast in battle. Indeed, the influence of the unmade Nogaul, which compelled all Alethi to revel in their violent passions, was especially strong in Dalinar. For, unbeknownst to anyone, including Dalinar himself, the younger of the two Kholin princes was being stoked by Odium, groomed to become the Dark Champion who would lead the Void Gods' Voidbringer armies when the Oathpact was broken and the True Desolation came to Roshar. But that day would not come for many years yet, so for now, Dalinar's love for battle was naught more than a useful tool used by his brother to unify a kingdom. In 1139 of the Vorin calendar, when both Gavilar and Dalinar were young men in their early 20s, the conquests began. One by one, Alethi princedoms on the border of the Kholin domain fell under Kholin control. Sometimes by Gavilar's shrewd politicking, sometimes by the edge of Dalinar's sword. One of the earliest princes to swear fealty to the Kholin banner was Toril Sadeas of the Sadeas princedom. A sharp politician and capable general, Sadeas would become a key ally to Gavilar in both the political and military battlegrounds in the wars to come. Meanwhile, Dalinar continued to build a reputation for himself as an unstoppable force of destruction. Despite the fact that he had yet to earn a shardblade or shardplate, Dalinar was still capable of clearing out a battlefield, losing himself in the ease of killing as he tore through entire battalions of soldiers with just himself and his small band of hand-picked elites. In one instance, while fighting through a town in the territory of one Bright Lord Yasriar, Dalinar was shot through the shoulder by a great bow-wielding assassin from a ridge over 300 yards away. Undaunted by the pain, the younger Kholin prince leapt onto a horse and, with an arrow still sticking out of his shoulder, chased down the archer and ran him down, capturing him alive. Rather than execute the assassin, Dalinar instead praised the man for his excellent marksmanship, and, seeking to put those skills to use, compelled the man into his elite honor guard, in exchange for not pillaging the town they had just captured. After this legendary encounter, Dalinar became known by his infamous moniker, the Blackthorn, after the black arrow that had been sticking out of his shoulder as he chased down his would-be assassin. Not long after that incident, Dalinar became even more formidable after claiming a set of shardplate from a rival Alethi Bright Lord. Normally, warriors in shardplate are completely invulnerable to practically any weapon, but apparently they aren't invulnerable to fall damage because Dalinar killed the man by kicking him off a cliff. Unfortunately for the Blackthorn, his endless luck on the battlefield was juxtaposed by a lack of fortune in the field of romance. Dalinar's one true love was a woman named Navani, a highborn Alethi lady from an ancient and prestigious family. These feelings were reciprocated, with Navani loving Dalinar as much as he loved her. Yet the Bright Lady was a politically ambitious woman who ultimately chose to prioritize affairs of state over affairs of the heart. Rather than court Dalinar, Navani instead wooed Gavilar, choosing to pursue matrimony with the brother who would be king instead of the brother she loved. The eventual marriage between Navani and Gavilar would forever be a black spot in the relationship between the Blackthorn and the Uniter of Alethkar. Yet, despite the anguish of seeing the woman he loved in the arms of his older brother, Dalinar's dogmatic loyalty to Gavilar never wavered. Navani, for her part, became an instrumental part of Gavilar's nation-building project. An exceptionally talented stateswoman and learned literati, she collaborated with other important women in the Kholin court, such as Aelai Sadius, to stabilize the territories that her husband and brother-in-law conquered. Perhaps the greatest military challenge standing between the House of Kholin and the unification of Alethkar was the city of Rathalas, known also as the Rift. Ruled by fierce Bright Lord Tanalan, the Rift was a heavily protected fortress city, built into the walls of a steep canyon that protected it from high storms and provided it a verticality that made conquering it through conventional means nearly impossible. The people of the Rift were fiercely independent-minded and resolved to resist assimilation into the regime of the Kholin tyrant by any means necessary. With the Rifters rejecting all of his political overtures, Gavilar had no choice but to deploy his Axehound, the Blackthorn, to bite the head off this beast. During the ensuing assault on Rathalas, Dalinar challenged Tanalan to single combat, a challenge the honor-bound Alethi Brightlord accepted. Tanalan was possessed of a shard blade, but no shard plate, while Dalinar possessed plate, but no blade. Their duel was a fierce one, but the thrill burned brighter in the Blackthorn than it did in the Lord of the Rift, and so Dalinar got the upper hand, mortally wounding Tanalan. Tanalan managed to retreat with the help of his men, and Dalinar pursued. When the Blackthorn caught up with his foe, he found him already dead, in the arms of his weeping widow, and protected by his son, a young boy bearing his father's shard blade. "You can't have my daddy," the boy said, words distorted by his sorrow. Pain spren crawled around the floor. "You can't, you... His voice fell to a whisper. "Daddy said, we fight monsters, and with faith, we will win." A few hours later, Dalinar sat on the edge of the rift, his legs swinging over the broken city below. His new shard blade rested across his lap. The shard blade that Dalinar had claimed that day was named Oathbringer. All shard blades were priceless and possessed of ancient and storied pedigrees, but this one was particularly special, for it was the blade which had once belonged to Sadis the Sunmaker, the last king to have united Alethkar under one banner. Its possession granted the House of Kholin a powerful symbol of legitimacy in their own quest of unification. As for the young boy and his mother, the thrill pulsing in Dalinar's heart had subsided when he looked upon them, and he had ultimately shown them mercy and allowed them to live. This decision would later come to haunt him. A year after the subjugation of Rathalas, the conquest had slowed down. The large majority of Alethkar had been conquered by the Collins and Gavilar, who was now properly styling himself as King of Alethkar, and had begun making arrangements for his still bachelor brother to find a suitable bride. In this, the most eligible single lady was Evi, a noble woman from the western kingdom of Rira. She and her brother To were political refugees, having fled their homeland in possession of one of Rira's ancestral sets of shardplate, and come to Alethkar hoping to secure asylum and a political marriage into the royal Kholin family in exchange for their priceless artifact. During a feast in their honor, Dalinar made an astounding first impression on his would-be brother-in-law and bride-to-be when he thoughtlessly stepped outside into the middle of a deadly raging high storm, dodging flying boulders and massive spindly-legged storm striders in search of a knife to slice his steak with. Returning to the storm bunker where the feast was taking place empty-handed, the Blackthorn eventually found a knife in the hands of an assassin disguised as a servant about to strike down his brother. Leaping across the table, Dalinar effortlessly slew the assassin, claimed his knife, and used it to eat his steak. Suffice to say, To agreed to betroth Evi to Dalinar shortly thereafter, confident that she would be well protected in the Blackthorn's hands. "It's like you're dead," Evi said. Dalinar looked over at her. "It's like you only live when you can fight," she continued. "When you can kill, like a blackness from old stories. You live only by taking lives from others." With that pale hair and light golden skin, she was like a glowing gemstone. She was a sweet, loving woman who deserved better than the treatment he gave her. From the beginning, the marriage between Dalinar and Evi was trouble in paradise. The Blackthorn was not a categorically bad husband, but while he learned to respect his wife, he never came to truly love her. After all, his heart still belonged to Navani, his now sister-in-law. Moreover, the gulf in personalities between the married couple was simply too vast. Evi was an empath and a pacifist who abhorred all violence on principle, regardless of reason. Dalinar, a warrior who lived for the thrill of combat, was her very antithesis. Evi experienced a ray of hope for her husband when she gave birth to her first son, who Dalinar embraced joyfully and gave the name Adolin, meaning born unto light in the Alethi tongue. Unfortunately, any hope that fatherhood might smooth out the Blackthorn's edges eroded away in the ensuing years. Without any wars to fight, Dalinar became restless. With the influence of the unmade spren Nergal in his heart, he had become reliant on the thrill of combat like it was a drug, and without it, he coped by abusing other substances, like drugs and alcohol. Eventually, Gavilar addressed his brother's deterioration by sending him off to war once more, this time to campaign along the borders of Hadaz and Jar Kaved as a show of the new Alethi kingdom's strength against their neighbours. Dalinar and Evi grew distant during this time, so much so that the Blackthorn missed the birth of his second son, Renarin, and only met him a year after his birth when Evi brought him to the battlefront. Faced with the increasing likelihood that she might be able to enjoy a normal family life free from war and destruction, Evi grew increasingly distraught. Moved by his wife's distress, the power of the thrill abated in Dalinar's heart, and he agreed to return from the war front and settle down with her and the children in the capital of Kholinar. First, however, he had one last battle to fight. Years after the conclusion of the Wars of Unification, embers of rebellion had begun to burn among the recently subjugated High Princes of Alethkar, embers stoked by none other than Bright Lord Tanalan the Younger of Rathalas, the very same boy who Dalinar had spared all those years ago after his father, Tanalan the Older, had died by Dalinar's hand. Deployed by his kingly brother to handle the situation, the Blackthorn's first instinct was to bring the rebellious people of Rathalas to heel, through fire and blood. But the temperate influence of his wife Evi, who had accompanied him on the campaign, instead compelled him to seek out a diplomatic solution first. These diplomatic overtures were surprisingly successful. Upon treating with Dalinar, the young Bright Lord Tanalan agreed not only to surrender to royal authority, but name all the other Bright Lords who had been secretly conspiring against the crown with him, under the conditions that he would be given full amnesty for his treason and would be depicted as having been secretly working for the Collins all along. As a final olive branch, Tanalan revealed that Toril Sadeas was one of the conspirators, and gave Dalinar the location of a hidden war camp where Sadeas was mustering his men to rise up against the crown. Thus Dalinar departed to punish Sadeas, but all was not as it seemed. It was only just as he approached the cavern that the war camp was in that Dalinar realized the trap, These men were not Sadeas' but Tanalan's. The rebels triggered a landslide that killed off all of Dalinar's men. Yet despite being buried under a mountain of boulders, the Blackthorn survived, managing to crawl back out through sheer force of will, and the raging power of the thrill now burning inside him. I intend to so thoroughly ruin this place that for 10 generations nobody will dare build here for fear of the spirits who will haunt it. We will make a pyre of this city, and there shall be no weeping for its passing, for none will remain to weep. Limping back to the Kholin war camps after his ordeal, the Blackthorn saw only red. His orders to his men were simple and chilling: death to Rathalas, death to the men, death to the women, and death to the children. As royal soulcasters began transmuting stone into oil to put the rift to the torch, Dalinar was beset one last time by his wife, who pleaded with him not to go through with this indiscriminate massacre. Still enraged, the Blackthorn brushed her off. Shortly after, Evie disappeared from the war camp under mysterious circumstances. Paying the mother of his children no mind, Dalinar set to his genocidal path. Screams below, then cries of pain, calls for mercy. People flooded from buildings, shouting in terror, fleeing on walkways and steps towards the basin below. Many buildings burned, trapping others inside. The rift behind him was becoming a pit of darkness and fire. In the midst of the inferno, the Blackthorn spotted Bright Lord Tanalan struggling in desperate vain to rescue his burning people, and had him pulled out from the rift. Tanalan prostrated himself before Dalinar, begging and pleading for the lives of his family to be spared, only to be informed they were already dead. The Bright Lord fell into despair, and yet that despair suddenly twisted into malicious, hateful glee when he realized the truth, realized what his enemy had cost himself that night. Tanalan blinked, then started laughing with a frantic, crazed air. "You don't know? How could you not know? But you killed our messengers, you poor fool! You poor stupid fool!" Dalinar seized him by the chin, though the man was still held by his soldiers. "What?" "She came to us," Tanalan said, "to plead. How could you have missed her? Do you keep track of your own family so poorly?" We will begin summarizing the first book in the series in Hearthstone, a small town in the northwest of the Kingdom of Alethkar, on the fringes of High Prince Sadeas' domain and home to a boy called Kaladin. Kaladin belonged to a family of the Second Nan, putting them in a high position within the internal caste system of dark-eyed commoners, but still inferior to the light-eyed elites. His father, gentle but stern Lirin, was the town's surgeon and a good friend to City Lord Wistiau, the light-eyed mayor of Hearthstone. From a very young age, Lirin began training his son as an apprentice surgeon, a career path which the young Kaladin chafed against. While educated healers were respected for their ability to save lives, male surgeons, like Kaladin's father, were treated with suspicion by the superstitious Alethi dark-eyed masses, whose Vorin religion taught them to see educated men as deeply unnatural. Thus, Kaladin struggled to fit in with or relate to the other dark-eyed boys in Hearthstone, who were all the sons of simple foot soldiers, rockbud farmers, and chul drivers several nans below him in the caste system. This social isolation drove Kaladin to want to pursue the path of a soldier, the highest calling a man could follow in Alethi Vorinism. However, his father's tutelage was strict, keeping Kaladin in the operating room and away from the spear. As isolated as Kaladin's upbringing was, he was far from alone. He had his little brother Tien, a font of innocence and youthful exuberance who brought joy into his older brother's otherwise dour childhood. In the year 1165, when Kaladin was 12 years old, City Lord Wistiau passed away. In the light-eyed mayor's will, he bequeathed a goblet of diamond bromes to the family of his good friend Lirin. These gemstones were among the most valuable denominations in Roshar's Stormlight-infused currency system, and represented a fortune to a dark-eyed family like Kaladin's. Sequestering away the diamond spheres, Lirin intended to wait until his son came of age, whereupon he would use the gems to send his son to study in Kharbranth, a city known for its world-class hospitals. "I don't want to be a surgeon," Kal said. "I'm terrible at it." Lirin sighed, rounding the steps, sitting down beside his son. "Kal, this happens. It's unfortunate, but you couldn't have done more. That little body lost blood too quickly." Kal didn't reply. "You have to learn when to care, son," Lirin said softly, "and when to let go." Unfortunately, Kaladin would never reach Kharbranth, for his family's fortunes took a sharp downturn with the arrival of City Lord Wistiau's replacement, a light-eyed noble named Torelin Roshar. Unlike his amicable predecessor, Roshar was hateful and corrupt. A miserable man, Roshar immediately accused Kaladin's father of having stolen Wistiau's diamond bromes by implying the surgeon forged his late predecessor's will, putting a target on Kaladin's entire family. Although Roshar had no proof of Lyrin's supposed trickery, and therefore could not punish him, he put the screws on the surgeon, using his position of influence to coerce the townspeople of Hearthstone to harass Lyrin's clinic. However unjustified the loathsome lord's behaviour was, Kaladin was nonetheless shocked when his father's private confession revealed that he had stolen Wistiau's gemstones in order to secure his son's future. Lyrin's relationship with his city lord would only deteriorate further after Roshar and his son, R'hllor, were rushed onto his operating table, both severely wounded during a White Spine hunt. With Kaladin's help, Lyrin was able to save Roshar's life, but R'hllor was not so lucky. Blaming the death of his son and heir on Lyrin, Roshar resolved to do everything in his power to increase the surgeon family's suffering. In the year 1168, a renowned Alethi general named Brightlord Amaram arrived in Hearthstone, looking to recruit some of the townsfolk into his army on a campaign to defend High Prince Sadeas' borders. Seeing his opportunity, Roshar put forward Kaladin's innocent younger brother Tien for conscription. Knowing that a soft, sensitive boy like Tien would almost certainly get slaughtered on the battlefield, Kaladin made a fateful decision. To the utter dismay of his father, he volunteered to join Amaram's army, abandoning the path of the surgeon and embracing the path of the soldier to protect his brother on the front. Unfortunately, this would be a futile endeavour. Tien was cut down on the battlefield like a rockbud polyp in the weeping. On that day, as he held the corpse of his younger brother, Kaladin realized with his own weeping eyes what his father the surgeon had told him from the day he began his medical training: you can never save everyone. It is here that we will leave the young Kaladin to grieve and move westwards from the war-torn fields of northern Alethkar to the idyllic shalebark valleys of the neighbouring kingdom of Jar-Kaved, where we will find the next main character of our story. Shallan Devar was a bright-eyed girl born to the noble Devar household. The youngest of 5 children, she grew up with 4 older brothers named Helleran, Balat, Wickim and Jushu. When Shallan was little more than a toddler, she made a new friend. This friend was not another little girl, boy, or even an axehound pup. It was a cryptic, the species of spren once bonded to the Radiant Order of Lightweavers. By this time in the era of isolation, the civilizations of mighty spren in the interdimensional realm of Shadesmar had finally begun recovering from the demographic collapse that had come after the ancient Knights Radiant had abandoned their oaths. Thus, many young spren crossed over into the physical realm, seeking humans to bond with, a process that stripped them of much of their intelligence and self-awareness. By the age of 11, Shallan had formed a Nahel bond with her cryptic. Without even truly realizing what she was doing, she had inadvertently learned how to summon her cryptic as a shardblade. Yet, as the young Radiant awoke her powers, she attracted the attention of unsavory actors in the shadows. As mentioned in a previous chapter, when the Knights Radiant laid down their shardblades over 2,000 years ago, the orders of Skybreakers refused to forsake their oaths as their 9 sister orders did. Under their patron, the immortal but incognito Herald Nail, they continued to operate in secret until the present day. Unfortunately, the shackles of immortality had burdened Nail's mind with delusions, convincing him that the only way to prevent the coming of the next desolation was to thwart the reformation of the Knights Radiant, something achieved by ordering his Skybreakers to murder any human other than a Skybreaker who bonded a spren. Unfortunately for Shallan, the Skybreakers had an operative within her very home, in the form of her own mother. So it was that, at the age of 11, Shallan's own mother tried to kill her for who she was, and so it was that, summoning her shardblade in self-defense, Shallan killed the woman who brought her into the world. Now go to sleep in chasms deep with darkness all around you. Though rock and dread may be your bed, so sleep, my baby dear. Now comes the storm, but you'll be warm, the wind will rock your basket. The crystals fine will glow sublime, so sleep, my baby dear. And with a song, it won't be long, you'll sleep, my baby dear. After witnessing what had happened, Shallan's father, Lyn Devar, rushed to the protection of his daughter. In an act of self-sacrifice, the Davar Patriarch covered up what his daughter had done by letting everyone believe it had been him who killed his wife, after allegedly discovering her in the company of an illicit lover. Tragically, the young and shell-shocked Shallan blamed her spren for her mother's murder. Without understanding the consequences of her actions, she broke her Nahel bond, killing her cryptic and transforming it into a Deadeyes. In the years that followed, Shallan's brain suppressed all memories of her spren and her mother's death as a coping mechanism, and by the time she was a teenager, she could no longer recall either event. Unfortunately, her father was not so lucky. Forced to become a pariah to protect his daughter, Lyn Davar became a bitter, resentful and abusive man. His descent into despotism was made worse when his eldest son, Helleran, disowned him for the supposed murder of his mother and left home. Throughout Shallan's teen years, Lyn Davar kept his household in a state of terror. He remarried with a young light-eyed named Malise, who he regularly beat violently. When Balat tried to elope with a girl he did not approve of, he had the boy's prized axehound pups put down as punishment. The Davar Patriarch even refused to lift a finger when his youngest son, Jushu, became a gambling addict and was kidnapped by loan sharks. By the time Shallan had turned 17, things had reached a boiling point in the Davar household. Unable to take it anymore, Balat once more made plans to elope with his lover, this time taking his brothers, sister and long-abused stepmother Malise with him. Unfortunately, Lyn discovered this plan, and in a rage beat Malise to death. It was here that Shallan realized her father was too far gone. So she resolved to do the unthinkable. Playing the submissive, obedient daughter, while Lyn viciously beat Balat to a pulp for his role in the escape plot, Shallan meekly offered her father a cup of wine, poisoned with deadly blackbane. The tainted drink was only partially successful, paralyzing the Davar Patriarch but not killing him. Thus, to finish the job, Shallan looped her necklace around her father's neck and twisted it tight. As she choked the life out of her father, Shallan sang a lullaby, "Sleep, my baby dear," the very same song that her father had sung to comfort her on the night of her mother's death. Let us now move on from the fertile plains of Jah Keved to the desolate, shattered plains of eastern Roshar, near the origin of the High Storm. These barren lands were home to the Listeners, the last free members of the ancient Singer race. Having given up the forms of power available to them when they were soldiers in Odium's Voidbringer legions, the Listeners had spent the last 2,000 years slowly recovering from the doldrums of Dullform and rediscovering the native rhythms and forms of Roshar once used by their ancient ancestors. One listener responsible for much progress in the reclaiming of this ancient knowledge was a woman called Venli, who contributed to her predecessors' discoveries of work form and mate form by rediscovering a form of her own, nimble form. However, much to Venli's chagrin, her achievements were consistently overshadowed by those of her itinerant sister, Eshonai. While Venli was a researcher, Eshonai was an explorer, charting the parts of Roshar long forgotten to the Listener people. It was during one of Eshonai's expeditions across the Shattered Plains when she encountered a royal expedition with none other than King Gavilar of Alethkar at its head. While the ancient Singers and humans had fought many wars against one another, this was the first time that any modern Listener had laid eyes on humankind, rendering Eshonai's discovery akin to first contact between two alien species. Over several expeditions, the Alethi and Listeners established tentative relations with one another and learned each other's languages. The Alethi, amazed at the novelty of an intelligent variant of their so-called Parshman slaves, called the Listeners Parshendi, which in their tongue meant Parshman who can think. During one of their many visits to Listener territory, a member of King Gavilar's retinue approached Venli, giving her a gemstone with a mysterious creature trapped inside. Burning with curiosity, Venli freed the being inside, who revealed itself to be a sapient form of spren named Ulim. Unbeknownst to Venli, the mysterious member of Gavilar's retinue had been a secret agent of Odium, and her new companion none other than a millennia-old void spren born of Odium's investiture. Ulim latched on to Venli. Knowing her dedication to discovering new forms for her people, he tantalized her with his ancient knowledge, helping her discover the formidable war form and promising to help her rediscover the even deadlier storm form, one of the very same void-light-infused forms of power that Venli's ancient ancestors had abandoned to free themselves from Odium's grasp. By exploiting Venli's feelings of inferiority over her more widely admired older sister, Ulim sought to manipulate her into leading the listeners down a path that would result in their reassimilation into Odium's Voidbringer legions. Unaware that any of this was going on, the leaders of the Listener and Alethi people concluded a formal peace treaty with one another, with the Alethi royal family inviting their new Parshendi allies to ratify their new friendship with an extravagant party in the royal palace of Kholinar. King Gavilar had never been one to rest on his laurels. Not content in restoring the glory of one kingdom, he now sought to reform the entire world by bringing back the antediluvian triumphs of the heraldic epochs, those ancient glory ages when the Heralds and the Knights Radiant had walked among mankind. Eventually, the king's grand dreams drew him into the Sons of Honor, a secret religious society whose mission was to restore the preeminent power of the Vorin Church by triggering a new desolation, which they believed would also cause the Holy Heralds to return, ushering in a new era of Vorin dominance. Over the years, King Gavilar became more and more absorbed in the mysteries and conspiracies of the Sons of Honor, and less involved in the governing of his kingdom. Consequently, the discovery of the Parshendi captured Gavilar's imagination. Unlike the majority of his nobles, who considered the thinking Parshmen to be savages, Gavilar saw them as an enclave of memories, a window into the past. So it was that the Parshendi became key to Gavilar's plan in bringing back the return of the Desolations, and in so doing, humanity's ancient wartime glory. Gavilar leaned forward, the light from the ruby leaking between his fingers. "I need you to deliver a message to your leaders. The Five? You're close to them, and I'm being watched. I need their help to achieve something." Now, he said. "I'm going to help you, Ishonai. Did you know I've discovered how to bring your gods back?" "No," she hummed to the rhythm of the terrors. "No." When Ishonai delivered the news of Gavilar's terrible plans, the listeners had been uniformly horrified. In order to prevent the King of Alethkar from summoning the very gods that had once enslaved them, they had resorted to desperate measures, to the murder of Gavilar Kholin. And yet, one of the strongest voices pushing for Gavilar's elimination had been none other than Venli. The void spren Ulim had been whispering in her ear, guiding her towards a certain truthless assassin from Shinovar who could do the job. By hiring Szeth to assassinate Gavilar, the listeners had been playing right into Odium's hands. In killing the king, they had plunged themselves into a war with Alethkar, a war they would not be able to win through conventional means, a war that would eventually make them desperate enough to turn to the very gods they had killed Gavilar to prevent the return of. A few months later, Dalinar Kholin slashed through the thick overgrowth of a hidden valley near the Mountains. When we last left off, the warmongering Blackthorn had just inadvertently killed his wife during the scouring of the city of Rathalas. Overcome by guilt, the once mighty warrior had begun drowning his sorrows in drink, his depression only becoming worse when, inebriated on the day of the royal feast, he could do nothing to prevent the death of his brother, the king. Here, in this forgotten valley, Dalinar was chasing after an ancient and unique spren known as the Nightwatcher, a powerful being wielding an old magic capable of making a man forget. Eventually, the Blackthorn found not just that ancient spren, but that spren's mother, the goddess of Roshar. A shard of Adonalsium, cultivation, had spent countless millennia on the sidelines of Rosharan history. While her beloved Honor had taken the mantle of humanity's protector, she had instead safeguarded the well-being of her planet in subtle ways. For Dalinar, however, she stepped out of the shadows, performing a pruning of his memories, so that he could have room to grow. When Dalinar emerged from the hidden valley, he found he could no longer recall any memories of his wife. All he could recall was that she existed and had been assassinated by his enemies. Feeling much better, Dalinar mounted his horse and set out for the east, where the armies of the Alethi High Princes were mustering to drive into the lands of the treacherous Parshendi who had killed their king. The War of Reckoning was about to begin. The Alethi War against the Listeners, also known as the War of Reckoning, was fought over highly unconventional terrain, even by Rosharan standards. Upon arrival, the Alethi found 10 crater-like formations at the edge of the Shattered Plains, once inhabited by the Listeners. The Alethi appropriated these craters, with each of the 10 High Princes claiming one and setting up a war camp for their armies. Rather than face the Alethi head-on, the Listeners retreated to a well-fortified ruin in the center of the plains, the remains of the ancient and long desiccated human kingdom of Natanatan. The Listeners called this place Narak, which in their tongue meant exile, and transformed it into a refuge for their people and main base of operations for the war. Sprawling between the Alethi and Listener forces was an endless expanse of plateaus divided by deep, treacherous chasms. These chasms made traversing the Shattered Plains incredibly difficult, making it impossible for the Alethi to advance directly into the heart of Listener territory. Although the Alethi outnumbered the Listeners, a Listener in war form was far stronger and sturdier than the average human soldier, capable of leaping directly across the chasms, while the puny shellless humans had to use cumbersome bridges. Additionally, the Listener military was united as one. In contrast, the Alethi had no central army command, with the 10 High Princes each doing whatever they pleased. The Shattered Plains were the native territory of a massive species of chasm fiend, who usually dwelt deep in the lush ravines between the plateaus. Infused with copious amounts of stormlight, a chasm fiend's gem heart was the ideal battery for soulcasters, empowering them to transmute metal, wood, and food. This made gem hearts a crucial resource in prolonging the war. Whenever a chasm fiend emerged onto the surface to pupate, both the Listeners and Alethi would rush to the location to hunt it. Before long, the War of Reckoning devolved into a disorganized series of Gemheart skirmishes, with the Alethi High Princes more focused on outcompeting their rivals in the claiming of these massive gemstones than actually gaining ground in Parshendi territory. In the months since the death of his brother, Tien, Kaladin had become a hardened soldier. Although still young, his bravery and prowess with a spear had earned him a promotion to sergeant, and his victories on the battlefield earned him the nickname Stormblessed from his men. However, he, nor his commander, Bright Lord Amaram, had been transferred to the Shattered Plains to fight the Parshendi. Instead, they remained in the territory of High Prince Sadeas, fighting inconsequential border skirmishes. In one of these skirmishes, a Shardbearer took to the field. No dark-eyed spearman would ever willingly take on a Shardbearer, but Kaladin was no normal Dark Eyes. He faced off with the Shardbearer and miraculously managed to kill him. By ancient custom, any man who slew a Shardbearer in battle was entitled to claim his Shard Blade. And yet Kaladin refused, fearing the man he would become if he gained access to a weapon of such mass destruction. Kaladin's reticence would be his undoing. In his place, the shards were claimed by Bright Lord Amaram, who betrayed Kaladin, slaughtered his entire squadron to cover up the truth, and sold him into slavery. Thus, Kaladin entered into a life in chains. After several failed escape attempts, his forehead was branded with the glyph Shash, meaning dangerous. While being transported in a slave caravan, he attracted the attention of a peculiar Windspren, who introduced herself as Sil. This was odd, as Windspren were normally mindless beings incapable of speech. Eventually, the slave caravan arrived at the Shattered Plains, where Kaladin was sold into the war camps of High Prince Sadeas as a bridgeman. Bridgemen were the dregs of the Alethi army. Consisting mainly of slaves, deserters, thieves, and foreigners, their main job was to carry portable bridges across the plateaus, so Sadeas' troops could cross the chasms. Deployed ahead of the regular soldiery and left deliberately exposed, bridgemen were meant to soak up Parshendi arrows that would have otherwise been loosed upon Sadeas' more valuable trained soldiers. Unofficially, the bridgemen existed to die so the soldier would live. Far away from the Shattered Plains, a young noblewoman arrived by boat in the city of Kharbranth. Having inherited crippling debts from their recently deceased father, the siblings of House Devar had hatched a scheme to prevent their lands and inheritances being seized. The youngest among them, Shallan, would travel to Kharbranth to petition one of Roshar's greatest scholars, Jasnah Kholin, to take her on as a ward. The sister of King Elhokar of Alethkar, Jasnah was in possession of a working soulcaster, a priceless artifact. Once in her good graces, Shallan was to steal the soulcaster, swapping it out with a replica, before escaping back home and pawning off the ancient transmutation device to pay their family's debts. Stealing from Jasnah was ontologically justified. Jasnah was a heretic, infamous for turning away from the church and denouncing the Almighty. Thus, pilfering a holy relic from her was surely not an immoral action. Soon, Shallan came face to face with her mark. During a meeting with Kharbranth's king, Taravangian, she petitioned Jasnah to become her ward, and through persistent effort, she managed to gain Jasnah's confidence and become her apprentice. Back in the war camps, a now aging Dalinar Kholin found himself less willing to prosecute the war against the Parshendi than the other high princes. When he had been young, his enthroned brother had been the politician and he the warrior. Yet in his twilight years, the thrill of Nergal no longer burned in Dalinar, and he sought to continue Galavar's nation-building legacy. He grew attached to the ancient book The Way of Kings by Nohadon, adopting its values of honor, humility, and dignity, and becoming critical of the competitive, warlike nature of the modern Alethi people. Moreover, ever since arriving at the Shattered Plains, Dalinar had begun receiving supernatural visions during high storms, which transported him to ancient apocalyptic landscapes, where he witnessed the ancient Knights Radiant doing battle with the Voidbringers, and heard a booming voice commanding him to unite them. Though others dismissed his visions as senility, Dalinar believed he had a divine purpose to unite the High Princes of Alethkar against the future cataclysm hinted at in these visions. Despite his nephew Elhokar's weakness as king, Dalinar remained devoted to Alethkar and protective of the throne, even as the High Princes paid only lip service to their king's authority. After seeing countless wretches die on just his first few bridge runs, life as a bridgeman had broken what little spirit Kaladin had left. Devoid of hope, he headed for the Honor Chasm, the ravine in which bridgemen could take the so-called honorable way out of their hellish and short lives. Yet before Kaladin could jump, he was confronted by Syl, the impish little wind spren who had been with him his entire journey. Imbuing Kaladin with new resolve, Syl convinced the despairing man not to give up. Kaladin returned to the camp with renewed purpose, resolving to shape up his bridge crew, Bridge 4. Initially, the bridgemen spurned his leadership, resigned to their imminent deaths. However, through the use of charisma, forced coercion, and setting an example, Kaladin eventually converted most of Bridge 4 into his devout followers. Over time, he got to know his men, making friends with the likes of Rock, a loud, boisterous horn-eater, Teft, an old grumpy greybeard, Moesh, a dour stoic, and Sigzil, a quiet, bookish Macabeki. Later additions to Bridge 4 included the Lopen, an energetic one-armed Hadazian jokester, and a robotic Parshman, who the bridgemen name Shen. In order to increase their odds of survival, Kaladin trained his men to side-carry their bridge instead of holding it over their head, in order to shield them better from Parshendi arrows. However, when Bridge 4 put this strategy to practice during a Gemheart skirmish, the result was a debacle. Although this method significantly protected the bridgemen, it was a strategic failure to Sadeas' army. The Parshendi archers realized Bridge 4 were too well protected, and focused their arrows on the bulk of soldiers instead, causing heavy loss of trained soldiers instead of expendable bridgemen. For the grave crime of ruining the High Prince's battle strategy by not being an easy target, Sadeas ordered Kaladin to be left to the Stormfather's judgment, a punishment during which he would be strung up outside during a high storm. To any normal man, this was a death sentence, but Kaladin was no normal man. Enduring the wrath of the torrential winds, rains, and debris with Syl by his side the entire time, the storm abated, and when men emerged from their storm bunkers expecting to see a bridgeman's lacerated corpse, they instead saw Kaladin open his eyes. As the Stormfather had judged him and allowed him to live, Sadeas had no recourse but to allow Kaladin to return to his bridge crew without further molestation. From that point on, Bridge 4 began to practically worship their seemingly immortal leader, while Kaladin began drilling them with discarded spears found on corpses in the chasms, training them to fight and preparing them to escape. Over in Kharbranth, Shallan had grown to love her new life and lose the will to steal from Jasnah. When not aiding Jasnah in her studies or engaging in her own, she began spending time with Kapsal, a charming ardent of the Vorin Church. Shallan developed a crush on this holy man, but Jasnah sternly warned Shallan that the church considered her their enemy and would likely use her wards to get close to her. Shallan also spent much of her time sketching, something she'd been talented in since childhood. Mysteriously, she found that whenever she did a drawing, she would subconsciously add mysterious supernatural creatures made up of fractal patterns to her canvas. Unbeknownst to her, these sketches were her subconscious recollection of the cryptics or Lyspren watching her from the shadows. Shallan's faith in her mistress was shaken when Jasnah took her ward into the crime-infested slums of Kharbranth, openly flaunting her jewelry in order to deliberately provoke a mugging. Sure enough, 4 footpads appeared out of an alley and accosted them. Jasnah killed them all, transmuting them into fire and smoke. To the cold and calculating Jasnah, this was a teachable moment, a philosophy lesson in the morals of killing, but Shallan was left deeply disturbed. Furious and shocked by her mentor's actions, Shallan decided to go through with the thievery after all, swapping her decoy soulcaster with Jasnah's real one. After the theft, cryptic spren continued to haunt the pages of her sketches with increasing frequency. Having no knowledge or memory of these eldritch creatures, Shallan became increasingly terrified, and in a panic, accidentally soulcast a goblet in her room into blood. Knowing Jasnah would soon arrive and discover her deception, Shallan cut her own wrist to hide the fact she had soulcast, which Jasnah mistook for a suicide attempt. After her recovery in one of Kharbranth's famed hospitals, Shallan was set to cut her wardship short, citing her mental health as a cover story for her to return to her family with the stolen soulcaster in her possession. The day before she departed, she spent one final evening with Jasnah. Capsule arrived, bringing them bread and jam, laced with poison. Jasnah had been right all along. The Ardent had been using Shallan to get close to her. Jasnah soulcast the poison out of her bread and into capsules, allowing her assassin to die from his own toxins. However, Shallan fell ill too. Jasnah attempted to soulcast the poison out of her blood to save her life. Yet Shallan knew that Jasnah's soulcaster was the fake one. If she attempted to use it, it would have no effect and Shallan would die. Believing she had no choice but to reveal her deception, Shallan used the last of her waning strength to confess her theft, revealing where she'd hidden the real soulcaster so Jasnah could use it to save her life. Shallan survived, but was cast out by Jasnah and left with no choice but to return to her deeply indebted family empty-handed. Yet in her lowest moment, she began to put the pieces together. Jasnah had avoided the effects of Capsel's poisoned bread by soulcasting the toxins, but unbeknownst to the scholar, she had been using Shallan's decoy soulcaster at the time. Here, Shallan realized the truth. Jasnah never needed a soulcaster to transmute matter at all. Her soulcaster, like Shallan's decoy, was a fake. Which meant that when Shallan had soulcast that goblet into blood, she had done it without a real soulcaster either. Both Jasnah and Shallan had mysterious latent powers Shallan did not understand. So, in a final gambit to restore her wardship, Shallan confronted Jasnah with the truth. Jasnah denied it, so Shallan did something drastic, calling to the cryptics she now knew watched her from the shadows. In ancient times, Radiance in the Order of Lightweavers did not speak ideals like their sister orders did, but revealed deep, raw truths about themselves to their cryptic spren to progress their bonds. Here, in this critical moment, Shallan offered up a truth. "I'm a murderer. I killed my father." Suddenly, Shallan plunged out of reality and into another, Shadesmar, the realm of spren and thought. Shocked, Jasnah used her surge of transportation to pull Shallan back into the physical realm, realizing that Shallan was the same as her, a Knight Radiant. Although still upset at Shallan for stealing from her, Jasnah could not pass up the opportunity to train a new Surgebinder, one of the first in millennia. Thus, she took Shallan back on as a ward. Back in the Kholin war camp, Dalinar made overtures with High Prince Sadeas, with whom he planned a joint attack on the Tower, a huge Parshendi-held plateau on the Shattered Plains. Although once close comrades, Dalinar and Sadeas had fallen out since Gavilar's death and become political rivals. Despite this, Dalinar trusted in his visions, which stressed the importance of unity. In fighting alongside the Sadeas banner, Dalinar hoped to inspire the other High Princes to work together as one, uniting them as his visions demanded he do. While all this was happening, Dalinar began a courtship with his brother's widow, Navani. Social taboos looked down on this, but the two had loved each other for decades. Unfortunately, no sooner did Navani finally get with the man she'd loved for decades, did she fall within inches of losing him. During the Battle of the Tower, Dalinar and his troops easily overpowered the first wave of Parshendi hordes, only to be ambushed and outnumbered by a second army. Here, Sadeas revealed his true treachery. He had never intended to fight with Dalinar. Sadeas thus retreated with his forces, leaving Dalinar, his son Adolin, and his armies stranded and encircled on the Tower Plateau. The Kholin forces fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and their efforts were doomed. As Sadeas and his armies returned to their encampment, Kaladin realized that he and Bridge 4 could use the chaos of Sadeas' betrayal to slip out of the war camps unnoticed. Yet just then, he saw Seal manifest and gaze upon the Kholin armies with despair. Witnessing a broken oath of such magnitude, she remembered who she truly was. She was no wind spren, but an honor spren, a spirit of oaths and promises. In that moment, Kaladin knew what he had to do. Sacrificing his chance at freedom, he rallied Bridge 4 and headed for Dalinar's army. Approaching the battle, Kaladin realized he was ready, and thus he spoke the ideal to his bonded partner Seal: "I will protect those who cannot protect themselves." Those words were accepted by the Stormfather, and Kaladin became the first Knight Radiant of the Order of Windrunners in over 2,000 years. His powers, latent and building within him since he had first met Seal, fully awakened. Invoking the surge of gravitation, he soared across the chasms, landing on the Tower Plateau and slaying hundreds of Parshendi, Stormlight infusing him with superhuman strength as he held back the listeners, allowing Bridge 4 to set down their bridge and allow what remained of Dalinar's army to retreat. Upon returning to the camps, Dalinar furiously confronted Sadeas, but there was little he could do to punish the rival High Prince without triggering a civil war in Alethkar. Before he left, however, he attempted to buy the freedom of the bridgemen who saved his life. Out of pettiness and spite, Sadeas refused. That is, until Dalinar summoned his Shardblade Oathbringer and offered it up in exchange for the bridgemen's lives. Sadeas stared dumbfounded, as Dalinar offered up a priceless artifact more valuable than entire kingdoms for the lives of some measly expendable slaves, before agreeing to the trade. Thus, due to the Blackthorn's sense of honor and sacrifice, Bridge 4 and all the bridge crews were free. Szeth's son Vallano had worn white on the day the Parshendi had hired him to kill King Gavilar. As a truthless of Shinovar, he was lower than a slave, a tool sworn to obey any who held his Oathstone. Unfortunately, that Oathstone was soon claimed by a mysterious stranger, who orders Szeth upon a killing spree of high-ranking targets throughout Roshar. Ordered to don the same white cloak he'd worn on the day of Gavilar's murder, Szeth prowls throughout Roshar, assassinating enthroned heads throughout the continent, including the Prime Akasix of Azir and the King of Jakaved. These royals were protected by the deadliest shardbearers in the realm, yet they fell like dominoes before the assassin in white. The shardblade Szeth carries was no ordinary shardblade, but the honor blade once wielded by the Herald Jezrien, which gave him the surge-binding powers of a Windrunner. After leaving much of Roshar in a state of political chaos, the last target on Szeth's list was the frail, senile old king of Kharbranth, Taravangian. Szeth travelled to the City of Surgeons to carry out his final hit, only for Taravangian to reveal he had been Szeth's employer all along, having put himself on his own list to deflect suspicion if Szeth was caught. Sometimes, Taravangian said, you must tear down a structure to build a new one with stronger walls. And we are going to need strong walls in the coming years. Very, very strong walls. With a chill, Szeth realized there was a far more ruthless ambition in the kind, grandfatherly old king than met the eye. Back in the war camps, Dalinar confronts Elhokar. Sick of having no power to wrangle the bickering, childish and backstabbing High Princes, he demands Elhokar give him the title High Prince of War, which the weak-minded king reluctantly agreed to after his uncle promised to protect him from the assassination attempts that would no doubt follow in the wake of that deeply unpopular decision. Some days later, a stranger crashes through the front gates of the Royal Alethi camp of Kholinar. A massive man, dressed only in a loincloth, covered in dirt and twigs, and carrying an honor blade. "Who are you?" the guards ask. The man, looking discombobulated, slowly replies, "Who am I? I am Telenel Ilin Stonesinew, Herald of the Almighty. The desolation has come. Oh God, it has come, and I have failed." After 4,500 years, the Herald Telenel Ilin had reappeared on Roshar. The Oathpact had failed, and soon the red-purple void light of Odium would plunge the storm-swept planet into a new era of cataclysm and apocalyptic war. One man who foresaw the return of the ancient desolations was the elderly Taravangian, king of the city-state of Kharbranth. Slow of wit but gentle in nature, there was more to this affable septuagenarian than met the eye. At some point during his reign, Taravangian went to visit the Nightwatcher, asking her for the capacity to save humankind. Taravangian was granted this wish, but as was always the case with the old magic of cultivation, there was a catch. Taravangian was given the knowledge and mental genius to prevent the True Desolation, but only for one day, during which he covered every surface of his bedroom in writing, code, and mysterious hieroglyphics. These cryptic scrawlings spelled out a brutal four-dimensional plan in which Taravangian could unite all of Roshar under his rule against the coming Voidbringers. The next morning, Taravangian's superintelligence faded, rendering him unable to interpret his own mad scribblings. Thereafter, Taravangian created a secret society known as the Diagram, a clandestine organization of conspirators whose purpose was to decipher the old king's titular diagram. Through this, Taravangian's group acquired the Oathstone of the deadly Assassin in White, whom they used to assassinate a swathe of world leaders across Roshar, paving the way for Taravangian's ascension. The diagram also helped Taravangian seize the throne of Jah-Keved, making him the ruler of the second largest nation on Roshar. After that, Taravangian set the Assassin in White upon the next leader whom the diagram called for the assassination of, Dalinar Kholin. Shortly after the disastrous Battle of the Tower, in which he had been betrayed by High Prince Sadeas, Dalinar realized a terrible truth. The booming voice in his visions had never been talking directly to him. The voice belonged to none other than Honor himself. During a high storm after the Battle of the Tower, Dalinar heard the voice of his deity finally reveal the truth to him. I was God, the one you call the Almighty, the creator of mankind. And now I am dead. Odium has killed me. I am sorry. The Almighty, supreme god of Vorinism, was dead. The visions Dalinar had been seeing were created thousands of years before his birth, around the time of the Recreance, when Honor was fading but not yet gone. During this time, Honor created visions which were meant to prepare future generations of humanity for the True Desolation, urging them to refound the Knights Radiant. He tasked the largest splinter of his investiture, the Stormfather, to pick out a suitable leader to show them to, and the Stormfather chose the Blackthorn. Convinced now of the coming doom, Dalinar hastened his efforts to bring the Alethi High Princes to heel. To that end, Dalinar turned to his firstborn son, Adolin. Having grown up into a fine young warrior, Adolin was one of the deadliest Shardblade duelists in Alethkar. By defeating the shard-wielding champions of the other High Princes in sanctioned contests, Adolin would be able to claim their priceless shardblades and shard plate, thereby depriving the High Princes of their greatest weapons, forcing them to cooperate with Dalinar. Adolin carved through the competition with ease, securing a half-dozen sets of shards from rival war camps in the process. However, progress ground to a halt as a new anti-Kholin coalition of High Princes formed under High Prince Sadeas, who instructed all duelists to stop engaging with Adolin. Another item on Dalinar's to-do list was the refounding of the Knights Radiant. He was not exactly sure how to do this, but unbeknownst to the Blackthorn, he had, as of recently, acquired one into his employ. After the events of the Battle of the Tower, Kaladin had become the captain of High Prince Dalinar's Honor Guard. This unit was composed exclusively of the former Bridgemen slaves, with the members of Bridge 4 serving as its officer corps. However, unbeknownst to their employer, Kaladin and his men were far more than just reformed slaves turned soldiers. Kaladin was now a fully fledged Knight Radiant, capable of manipulating gravity and lashing objects together. Moreover, as his closest companions, Kaladin's Nahel Bond recognized the members of Bridge 4 as his Radiant Squires, giving them access to the surges as well when in Kaladin's presence. Although grateful to Dalinar, Kaladin hid his powers from the High Prince. While Kaladin respected his new employer, he still harbored a deep distrust for Light Eyes. Kaladin's paranoia was further inflamed when his former commander, Bright Lord Amaram, arrived on the Shattered Plains. When Kaladin attempted to inform Dalinar of the betrayal he suffered at Amaram's hands, Dalinar advised him to keep quiet, for Amaram was too politically valuable an ally to alienate. One man who sympathized with Kaladin's hatred was his closest friend, the Bridge 4 member Moash. Taking Kaladin aside, Moash confided to his commander that he was involved in a secret plot to assassinate Elhokar, a man he held personally responsible for all his misfortunes. Syl, for her part, was deeply disturbed by this idea, but Kaladin was not so quick to dismiss it. Kaladin made no commitments, but promised Moash he would at least consider joining in his conspiracy. However, before Kaladin could play at regicide, he would ironically have to face off with Roshar's most prolific king killer. During a high storm, the Assassin in White broke into the king's enclosure on the Shattered Plains and made for Dalinar. The Blackthorn, Adolin and Kaladin engaged the Pale Shin, Face of Death, but with Jezrien's Honor Blade granting him the surges, Szeth was an opponent beyond any of the Kholin Shardbearers. It was only after Szeth cut his honor blade through Kaladin's arm, but saw him unconsciously heal the wound by sucking in Stormlight, that the assassin hesitated. Realizing that, like him, Kaladin possessed the powers of a Windrunner, he experienced a sudden bout of manic terror and fled. While this was happening, a Thaylen vessel called the Wind's Pleasure was carrying Shallan Devar and Jasnah Kholin to the Shattered Plains. After taking Shallan back on as a ward, Jasnah revealed that she knew of the coming desolation, and her research back in Kharbranth had yielded 2 key pieces of information that could help prevent it. The first was that the Parshmen, the dull-witted, non-human slaves found in every nation throughout Roshar, were the descendants of the Voidbringers. The second was that one of the Oathgate portals, which had connected the 10 ancient Silver Kingdoms to Urithiru, was located on the Shattered Plains, and locating it was the key to locating the ancient Radiant Fortress city. Jasnah had also arranged for Shallan to be wed to her cousin, Prince Adolin, a match that Shallan accepted happily without complaint. As a budding member of the Radiant Order of Lightweavers, Shallan spent much of her time on the Wind's Pleasure learning about the spren she had bonded with, a cryptic named Patton. Despite his eldritch appearance, Patton was a whimsical creature. Shallan and Patton quickly grew familiar with each other, with Shallan satisfying Patton's endless questions about human nature and habits, and Shallan experimenting with lightweaving, a form of illusion magic used by the titular Lightweavers. One night, Shallan was woken suddenly in her sleep to the sound of screams. Realizing with horror that the Wind's Pleasure was under attack, she rushed on deck, just in time to see her mentor, Jasnah, being stabbed through the heart. In a panic, Shallan managed to draw in Stormlight, and perhaps more as a fluke than due to trained skill, soulcast the entire ship into water, plunging both her and the mysterious attackers into the ocean. Washing up on shore, soaking and freezing, she eased herself past the dimensional barrier into Shadesmar with Patton's help, where she found a bead that represented a wooden stick, trying to soulcast it into a fire she could use to warm her bones. The stick refused, adamantly wanting to remain as a stick. "I am a stick!" Stick. Shallan was soon picked up by a slave caravan, where she used her noble status to secure passage to the Shattered Plains. On the journey, they encountered another caravan under attack by bandits and Alethi deserters. Using her lightweaving, Shallan convinced the deserters to switch sides and defeat the bandits, promising them amnesty upon reaching their destination. She then befriended one of the women she rescued named Tin, a con artist who trained her in the art of deception. Later, Shallan discovered that Tin was associated with a group called the Ghostbloods, the organization responsible for Jasnah's death. Realizing the jig was up, Sin turned on Shallan, but Shallan killed her in a deadly fight. Seizing Tin's contacts, Shallan arranged a meeting with the Ghostbloods under an alias. After an arduous journey, Shallan finally arrived on the Shattered Plains. Initially, the Alethi nobility looked on the foreign Vaden woman in the company of deserters with suspicion, doubting her true identity. Brightness Navani, for her part, was furious and heartbroken, refusing to believe that her daughter Jasnah was dead. Nevertheless, Shallan managed to secure a place for herself in the war camps of the eccentric High Prince Sabariel. From there, she began a relationship with her betrothed, Prince Adolin. Their courtship was an awkward one, but Adolin found the young redhead and her odd questions about how he evacuated his bowels while in Shardplate to be amusing, and the two began hitting it off. Now settled in, Shallan continued Jasnah's research, looking for clues as to where on the Shattered Plains the Oathgate to Urithiru was located. She also had a tense encounter with a liaison of the Ghostbloods, Mraize. Using her lightweaving to transform into a dark-eyed woman named Vale, supposed servant of Tin, Shallan was able to get her foot in the door of that clandestine order. The Ghostbloods were an organization with deep tendrils and a presence not just on Roshar, but on multiple planets throughout the Cosmere. By pretending to cooperate with them, Shallan could learn a lot, but was also putting herself in immense danger. Meanwhile, Adolin had been attempting to bait Sadeas' allies into dueling with him. His latest target was the son of High Prince Ruthar, who refused to rise to Adolin's goading until Adolin offered to duel with him at a disadvantage. "If you're afraid," the Kholin prince needled, "you don't have to duel me alone." Appropriately provoked, Ruthar agreed. Unfortunately for Adolin, he really should have chosen his words more carefully. Adolin had expected that Ruthar would only bring a single +1, but he never specified how many extra opponents Ruthar could bring. When Adolin stepped into the arena on the day of the duel, he found himself up against 4 Shardbearers, the maximum allowable under Alethi dueling conventions. Adolin fought like a white spine, but the numbers were too much to overcome and he was soon overwhelmed. Desperately, Dalinar appealed to the watching Light Eyes, begging for someone to step in. "What has happened to us?" Dalinar asked. "Where is our honor?" "Honor is dead," a voice whispered from beside him. Dalinar turned and looked at Captain Kaladin. He hadn't noticed the bridgeman walking down the steps behind him. Kaladin took a deep breath, then looked at Dalinar. "But I'll see what I can do." The 4 Shardbearers were deadly duelists, but no match for a true Knight Radiant, even one armed with only a spear and concealing his true powers. Together with Adolin, the bridgeman defeated Roshar and his 3 cronies with ease. The duel was won, but their triumph was soon soured when Alethkar offered Adolin a king's boon for his victory, to which Kaladin stepped forth, demanding the right to challenge Meridus Amaram, the man who had sold him into slavery. King Alethkar was apoplectic at this common dark-eyed soldier who had the temerity to demand a duel with the Light Eyes so far above his station, and had the bridgeman seized and thrown in prison. Alethkar wished to have Kaladin executed, but Dalinar would not stand for it, and was able to secure Kaladin's release. Prince Adolin had also spent time in prison, out of voluntary solidarity with the bridgeman who had saved his life. Upon his release, Adolin offered Kaladin one of the Shardblades, one of the defeated duelists. Kaladin refused, instead giving the Shardblade to his most trusted soldier, Moash. It was here that, secretly, Kaladin pledged to aid Moash in his plot. Alethkar was a tyrant, and he had to die. With more of the High Princes now gravitating to his camp, Dalinar began making plans to end the war with the Parshendi once and for all by putting an end to the disorganized Gemheart skirmishes and launching a military expedition deep into the Shattered Plains to strike directly at the Parshendi home base. To that end, a preliminary scouting mission was planned, one which Shallan joined, hoping to scope out the location of the Oathgate to Urithiru. Disaster struck on this expedition as a mechanical bridge, deliberately sabotaged by Sadeas' agents, collapsed while Dalinar was crossing a chasm. Kaladin reacted quickly, managing to get Dalinar off the bridge, but both he and Shallan plunged down into the depths below. Miraculously, both Kaladin and Shallan survived the deadly drop. The two began traversing the chasms. Kaladin attempted to draw on his powers, but found them greatly weakened. With horror, he realized he had damaged his Nahel bond with his spren, for in agreeing to aid in Ellekar's assassination, he had forsaken his Radiant Oath to protect those who can't protect themselves. Thanks to Shallan's eidetic memory and sketchbook, the pair were able to map their way out of the chasms, but not before being caught by a roaming chasm fiend which Kaladin had to slay, sustaining a serious wound to the leg in the process. The pair returned to Dalinar's war camp, where Kaladin was transferred to a medical triage and witnessed something that lifted his spirits. In a dramatic confrontation that unfolded before his very eyes, Dalinar turned upon Meridus Amaram, finally recognizing him for the traitorous snake he was, and dismissing him from the service of the House of Kholin. This act of justice immediately earned Dalinar some good karma when Shallan shared some critical intelligence with him. By sketching out her path through the chasms, Shallan had realized the plateaus on the Shattered Plains formed a symmetrical pattern. Extrapolating from this pattern, she could help locate the geographical center of the plains, where the Parshendi home base was located. By this time, the War of Reckoning had dragged on for over 6 years, devastating the Listener people and leaving them feeling increasingly hopeless. This despair was exactly what Ulim, a void spren working for Odium, had aimed for. After manipulating the Listeners into a war they couldn't win, he now sought to exploit their desperation, collaborating with the scholar Venli to recreate Stormform, an ancient form of power used by the Listener's ancestors whose rediscovery could save her people and finally elevate Venli above her sister Eshonai among their peers. Traditionally, Singers achieved Stormform by capturing Stormspren, a rare type of void spren, in their gemhearts. Stormform granted great power, but also corrupted the user, filling them with aggression and hate. When Venli succeeded in capturing Stormspren, she informed Eshonai and their leaders. Eshonai was extremely hesitant to endorse Stormform. In recent years, she had been leaning towards seeking peace with the Alethi, not escalation. Nevertheless, Eshonai agreed to test it, volunteering herself. Upon adopting Stormform, her personality became violent and warlike. Now driven by Odium's influence, Eshonai commanded all listeners to adopt Stormform. Listeners who refused were killed, and a few, mostly children and elderly, escaped into the Shattered Plains, leaving the rest to be transformed into twisted beings of lightning and void light. Seeking to end the War of Reckoning once and for all, Dalinar called the High Princes to his banner. Not all joined him, but Royon, Aladar and Sebarial did, marking significant progress in the Blackthorn's efforts at unification. Together, these 4 Alethi armies marched as one towards the center of the Shattered Plains, where Narak awaited. Meanwhile, back in the war camps, a still injured Kaladin was struggling with guilt, his complicity in the impending murder of King Elhokar gnawing at him. In that moment, Kaladin made up his mind and rushed towards the king's enclosure to save him. He found the king in his chambers, blackout drunk. Knowing the assassins were closing in, Kaladin lugged the royal deadweight down a corridor, but was confronted by Moash and his co-conspirators. A fight broke out, but wounded and divested of his radiant powers, Kaladin was no match for Moash and his Shardblade. With a regretful apology spoken to his old friend, Moash raised his blade, readying to finish Kaladin off. In that moment, Kaladin heard a voice calling out to him, tiny and distant, yet unmistakable, "Syl." In that moment, he knew the words he had to say. "I will protect even those I hate, so long as it is right." The third ideal of the Windrunners had been spoken, and with it, Kaladin was redeemed, his oath restored. He exploded with light, Stormlight healing him, and his powers returning to him, Syl having formed into a Shardblade in his hand. Moash and his co-conspirators fled in terror. Meanwhile, Dalinar's armies arrived upon Narak, only to realize they had thrown themselves out of the frying pan and into the fire, as they were immediately set upon by a horde of storm-form beasts, slinging a tempest of lightning at them through their fingertips. Thus the battle was joined, with groups of transformed listeners engaging the Alethi on several plateaus. The soldierly discipline of the Alethi held, even against such terrible powers, but they were unable to stop the listeners from singing a twisted song, which summoned the very thing their new form was designed to bring unto Roshar, the Everstorm. The Everstorm was a high storm in reverse, blowing from west to east instead of east to west, and infused with Odium's red-violet voidlight instead of Honor's blue-white stormlight. As a crimson tempest bore down upon the clashing armies from the west, the Stormfather responded by summoning a high storm, with 2 hurricanes now closing in on Listener and Alethi alike, 1 red and 1 blue. In this utter chaos, Prince Adolin found and confronted Ishonai. The two duelled with their Shardblades, and Adolin achieved the upper hand, knocking Ishonai down a chasm, where she would eventually drown in the Stormwater Flood. Meanwhile, Shallan was hard at work locating the Oathgate. She managed to discern a plateau near Narak which did not fit into the symmetrical pattern of the plains, realizing the portal must be there. Rushing to it with a team of scholars, she located the entrance of the Oathgate's control building, buried under centuries of Krem buildup. As storming chaos continued, Zeth appeared on the battlefield. He made for Dalinar, subduing the Blackthorn and lashing him to the sky, sending him plummeting upwards to his death, only for a fully Stormlight-infused Kaladin to descend down from the skies, delivering Dalinar safely back to the ground. The Windrunner and the Assassin in White both took off, dueling in the skies, until Kaladin emerged triumphant, ostensibly killing Gavilar's murderer once and for all, and recovering Jezrien's Honor Blade. Meanwhile, Shallan struggled to figure out how to activate the Oathgate. It was plain to see from the mechanisms that a Shardblade was the key, but using the dead blades of her accompanying Shardbearers bore no results. It was only then that Shallan realized only a living Radiant spren could activate the Oathgate. Summoning Patton as a Shardblade, she inserted him into the Oathgate mechanism, successfully activating it. Thereafter, the Alethi armies fled through the portal, escaping the Shattered Plains just before the fatal collision of the two storms. Thus, Dalinar, Kaladin, Adolin, Shallan, and most of the Alethi High Princes arrived in Urithiru, the ancient tower city of the Knights Radiant. As the Alethi explored the towering ruins of an ancient legend come to life with wonder, Adolin was confronted by Sadeas, who unwisely taunted Adolin about how his plans to undermine Dalinar had only just begun. Finally, the honourable young Kholin snapped. Sadeas had expected that the Alethi codes of honour would protect him from the consequences of anything he said. He was wrong. Drawing his side knife, Adolin murdered Sadeas in cold blood. Far away from this event, a certain Jasna Kholin re-manifested in the physical realm. As a Knight Radiant of the Order of Elfcallers, she had not been killed on the Wind's pleasure, but had thrown herself into Shadesmar at the last moment. Now she made her way to the ancient Radiant capital, which had been rediscovered in her absence. Standing atop the tower of Urithiru, Dalinar spoke with the Stormfather. With Kaladin and Shallan's powers now revealed to him, he knew the Radiants had returned, and knew they needed a leader. Thus he spoke the oaths, I will unite instead of divide. I will bring men together. Thus, Dalinar bonded the most ancient and mighty of spren, the Stormfather himself, and in so doing, became a Knight Radiant of the Order of Bondsmiths. So it was that the conflict on the Shattered Plains had come to an end. King Gavilar had been avenged, the Parshendi defeated, Urithiru discovered, and the Knights Radiant reformed. But at what cost? The War of Reckoning was over, but the True Desolation had come. As the Everstorm circumnavigated Roshar, it laid towns, cities, and entire nations to waste, smashing into them from the opposite direction of the high storms they were built to be sheltered against. Moreover, the Everstorm ushered in the return of Odium's forces, such as the Thunderclasts, the Voidspren, and most importantly, the Fused. The Everstorm also awakened the Parshmen, the slave-form singers who for centuries had been reduced to a slave caste in human society. Restored of their sentience, they were all eventually rounded up by Odium's Voidspren and consolidated under the rule of the Fused. With legions of newly awakened singers at their command, the Fused embarked on a war of conquest against the human kingdoms of Roshar, many of whom were still weakened due to the schemes of Taravangian and the Diagram. Alethkar was quickly overrun, as the majority of her armies were still in the Shattered Plains, or as of recently, Urithiru. Only the royal capital of Kholinar held out against the Voidbringers. Meanwhile, what few Stormform listeners survived the Battle of Narak were turned into vessels for the Fused, rendering the listener people functionally extinct. The lone exception was Venli, who Odium turned into a mouthpiece, using her to energize the singer's zeal to punish their former human masters. Do you understand watching your family be torn apart and knowing you should object, knowing deep in your soul that something is profoundly wrong? Can you know that feeling of being unable to say a single storming word to stop it? They may have taken your freedom, but they took our minds. Sar the Parshman to Kaladin. As Odium's influence spread across the Rosharan supercontinent, a nucleus of resistance emerged in the newly rediscovered Tower City of Urithiru, the ancient capital of the Knights Radiant. Over 2,000 years after the ancient Radiants forsook their oaths, their orders had been reformed. Under the leadership of the bondsmith Dalinar Kholin, several recently refounded orders were now thriving, especially the Windrunners, consisting of Kaladin's former bridgemen, and the Lightweavers, consisting of Shallan's former deserters. Dalinar took on the title of High King of Urithiru. Following this, King Elhokar swore fealty to his uncle, and the majority of the High Princes all fell in line. However, one Alethi faction remained untrustworthy, that of Sadeas, now under the command of Bright Lord Amaram. Moreover, not all Radiant Orders were loyal to Dalinar, as the allegiances of the Order of Skybreakers remained uncertain. One of these Skybreakers was none other than the Assassin in White, who had been revived by Nail and invested with Nightblood, a pitch-black sentient sword from another world. One of Dalinar's first projects as High King of Urithiru was to create a coalition of united Rosharan nations, not only to create a united front against Odium's forces, but to reconnect Urithiru to the ancient Oathgates, so he could teleport troops across the continent with ease. At first, most of the world leaders of Roshar refused to treat with Dalinar, due to his violent past as the Bloody Blackthorn. Thankfully for Dalinar, he soon found out that he could literally haunt their dreams with his bondsmith powers. By showing up in their sleep, Dalinar was able to convince several world leaders to ally with Urithiru. These included Fen, the no-nonsense elderly Sea Queen of Thaylen, and Gorks, the child who had recently been made Prime Akasix of Azir. An alliance with the Prime Akasix came with a strong bonus: his good friend Lift, a former street urchin girl bonded to a cultivation spren named Windle, and the first member of the Order of Edge Dancers in the modern day. One of the first monarchs to join the Urithiru coalition was Taravangian, the king of Kharbranth, and as of recently, Jar Kaved. Having given up on trying to have Dalinar killed, Taravangian now sought to secretly undermine the Blackthorn and seize control of his growing alliance. Meanwhile, as Dalinar united the world, his memories of his first wife, Evi, had begun returning, and he began reliving the memories of his troubled relationship with her. Seeking to begin the liberation of his occupied kingdom, King Elhokar led a strike team consisting of Kaladin and Shallan and their Windrunners and Lightweavers to infiltrate Kholinar, activate its Oathgate, and allow the armies of Alethkar to teleport in and break the siege. Sneaking past the walls with light-weaving disguises, they found Kholinar under assault by the Shanaim, and while the Wall Guard was putting up a brave resistance, it was wholly outmatched by the Flying Fused and their aerial bombardments. Furthermore, the city's Alethi nobility had all fallen under the Cult of Moments, a doomsday society which induced its followers to abandon their lives and responsibilities and engage in a lifestyle of hedonism and wasteful excess. This chronic decadence was the influence of the unmade Ashurtman, who had corrupted the heart of Elhokar's wife, Queen Aesudan. After some brief reconnaissance, the strike force stormed the palace to find Aesudan in Ashurtman's black-veined embrace. The Radiance chased away the Unmade, but it was too late. Odium's armies broke through the walls, and a horde of fused and singers stormed into the palace. Among them was Moash, who stabbed his shard blade into Elhokar's back. The King of Alethkar was dead, and Kholinar had fallen. Kaladin, Shallan and Adolin fled towards the Oathgate to teleport to Urithiru, but unbeknownst to them, the Oathgate was corrupted by the Unmade, and hurtled them into Shadesmar instead. Stranded in the cognitive realm, they struggled to find a way home while evading the Fused, who controlled much of Shadesmar. In this realm, Adolin's Shardblade was revealed as Myalaran, a Deadeye's cultivation spren, an ancient Edgerunner's now deceased companion. Though comatose and screeching when summoned, Adolin treated the corpse that was his sword with kindness, sparking faint signs of life and managing to learn her name, Myalaran. In Urithiru, Dalinar anxiously awaited news from Kholinar as the coalition he built began falling apart, partly due to Taravangian's agents translating the Ilia Stele. This ancient Singer text revealed humanity's origin as non-native to Roshar and the original Voidbringers. This revelation led the nation of Iri to declare for Odium's forces, and the Order of Skybreakers to officially join forces with the Singers, declaring that they were the rightful rulers of the land. Taravangian also spread false rumors of Dalinar's ambitions to dominate other nations, prompting Azir to leave the coalition. Dalinar's despair deepened as memories of Evi's death resurfaced, forcing him to relive the moment he burned her alive in Rathalas. Struggling between his monstrous past and his efforts to change, Dalinar would soon face his greatest challenge. After annexing Maret and Emul, Odium's armies were now advancing on the capital city of Thaylen, defended primarily by the dubiously loyal Amaram and his Sadeas troops. When Dalinar and his allies arrived on the scene, they found that Odium himself had taken to the field as a reflection of his true self. Moreover, he had brought a mutual friend of his and Dalinar's, Nergaul the Thrill. Odium unleashed Nergaul on the Sadeas soldiers, which sent them into a frenzy, turning them against the city. With defeat imminent, Dalinar stepped out onto the fields beyond Thaylen city to confront Odium, who explained to Dalinar that he had been influencing him with the Thrill his entire life. Dalinar had become the monster he was in his youth, massacring the people of Rathalas and killing his own wife because of Odium's influence. Odium had made Dalinar into the man he was, and now he called on Dalinar to embrace the Thrill one final time and become his dark champion. And yet... "I did kill the people of Rathalas," Dalinar shouted. "You might have been there, but I made the choice. I decided." He stilled. "I killed her. It hurts so much, but I did it. I accept that. You cannot have her. You cannot take her from me again." Surging with newfound strength, Dalinar threw off Odium's influence and swore the next oath of the Bondsmiths. Stormlight coursing through him, he reached into the spiritual and cognitive realms, bringing them together and opening a portal which allowed Shallan, Kaladin and Adolin to return from Shadesmar. Odium watched in horror as Dalinar became a manifestation of Honor's magic, the same magic of bonds and oaths which had sealed him in the Rosharan system thousands of years ago. The god fled in sheer terror, and the battle began. Shallan created an army of light-weaving illusions to distract the possessed Sadeas troops, while Adolin dueled a massive thunderclast. Kaladin confronted Amaram, now bonded to the unmade Yelig Nar, and finally settled the score with him, while Jasna joined the fray with Renarin, who had bonded to a corrupted Mist Spren and become a Radiant Truthwatcher. Dalinar also received an unexpected new ally, the Assassin in White. Having broken off from the rest of the Skybreakers, Szeth no longer mindlessly served tyrants at the behest of his Oathstone, but had chosen to submit himself to Dalinar, a man whose cause he believed in. He and Lift chased down a squadron of Fused in possession of the King's Drop, a perfect gemstone capable of sealing away Nergaul. With the King's Drop recovered, Dalinar managed to seal Nergaul away forever, bidding farewell to the Thrill which had been with him his whole life and turned him into the violent man he had once been. The victory at Thaylen City resulted in the reformation of the Coalition of Monarchs, with the Empire of Azyr rejoining the fold. 1 year later, the Knights Radiant launched an expedition into occupied Alethi territory to rescue a brilliant Herdazian general, the Mink, who was hiding from the Fused in Kaladin's hometown of Hearthstone. The journey to Hearthstone was undertaken on the Fourth Bridge, a floating ship which used fabrial technology to move through the air. The brainchild of Navani Kholin, a renowned artifabrian, it was the first flying vehicle Roshar had ever seen. Dogfighting with flying fuse in the skies, the Windrunners managed to find and extract the Mink, but not before Kaladin found himself lured into a fight with his old friend Moash. Believing that no one was capable of killing Kaladin other than Kaladin himself, Moash induced painful visions in his former comrade, forcing him to relive his traumas as he tried to convince Kaladin to end his own life. Kaladin froze up, helpless under the mental assault, before Renarin swept in and chased Moash off. Thereafter, the entire town of Hearthstone, including Kaladin's mother and father, were delivered aboard the Fourth Bridge and evacuated to Urithiru. Kaladin's fugue state was not a unique occurrence. Ever since the fall of Kholinar, his battle trauma had been catching up to him, freezing him up during critical moments. Recognizing the danger Kaladin posed to himself and others, Dalinar made the harsh decision to take him off active duty. Although reluctant to be taken off the battlefield, Kaladin soon acquiesced and went to join his father in the Urithiru clinics, reviving his life as a surgeon, while also looking for ways to support war veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder like he was. In this, he was joined by a fellow Windrunner, his old Bridge 4 comrade Teft. Although Dalinar wished to retake Alethkar, he was advised by the Mink to instead first make a drive at the partially occupied Kingdom of Emul, where Odium's control was more tenuous. Thus, a massive allied coalition marched forth for that territory. Led by Dalinar, it consisted of most of the Knights Radiant and Alethi forces in Urithiru, as well as the armies of Azyr and Jar-Kaved. Also present on the expedition was the newly crowned Queen Jasna Kholin, who had succeeded her brother Elhokar as Alethkar's first female ruler. Although the expedition won some initial victories, Dalinar was deeply troubled. After the Battle of Thaylen Field, his friend Taravangian had come clean to him, revealing all, from the diagram to the assassinations to his plan to usurp him. These revelations had shocked Dalinar and made him fully prepared that Taravangian would soon openly turn on the coalition. Sure enough, the armies of Jar-Kaved betrayed their allies, but were quickly encircled and subdued, for Dalinar had anticipated their treachery. Taravangian's betrayal had been easily thwarted by design, and as the old king was arrested and brought under house arrest, he made a new plan to kill Odium, one which involved Dalinar's new bodyguard Szeth and the mysterious otherworldly sword he carried. While Dalinar was retaking land on Roshar, he had deployed Adolin and Shallan to regain influence in Shadesmar. Many sentient spren were still deeply distrustful of humanity, resenting the ancient Radiants for the devastation they had wrought upon spren society during the Recreance, the truth behind the ancient spren's sacrifice lost to time. Thus Adolin and Shallan departed for Lasting Integrity, the city of the Honor Spren, where they hoped they could heal ancient wounds and convince more Honor Spren to help create more Windrunners to aid in the war effort against Odium. Unbeknownst to Adolin, Shallan had been ordered by the Ghostbloods to assassinate a man called Ristaris, a human allegedly living in Lasting Integrity. Shallan's mental state had been deteriorating further, having used her light weaving to create two new personas for herself: Veil, a dark-eyed drudge she transformed into while performing espionage, and Radiant, a confident shard-wielding heroine she transformed into when combat was necessary. In addition, she had begun slipping into a third persona, Formless, the manifestation of Shallan's submerged childhood trauma, and the part of herself willing to commit dark deeds to achieve her goals, such as murder on behalf of the Ghostbloods. When Shallan and Adolin arrived at Lasting Integrity, they found that while many Honor Spren within the city wished to bond with humans, its Honor Spren leadership were staunchly anti-human. Refusing to entertain diplomacy, they instead insisted on putting Adolin on a show trial to answer for the crimes committed by his human ancestors during the Recreance. Meanwhile, Shallan's predicament was complicated by the revelation that the judge for the trial was the very same Ristaris she had been sent to kill, whose true identity was tortured and partially insane Kalak, Herald of the Almighty. After entertaining a gaggle of sham witnesses, Adolin's trial reached its lowest point when the Honor Spren brought forth Myalarin, seeking to use her as a prop to demonstrate the mistreatment of Deadeye's spren at human hands. Unfortunately, this backfired on them spectacularly. We chose. Finding the strength to speak in defense of Adolin, Maelaran revealed the truth about the Recreance, that their ancient spren ancestors had willingly sacrificed themselves so the Radiance of old could walk away from their oaths. Meanwhile, Shallan encountered another Deadeyes being cared for by the Honor Spren, the cryptic she had killed in her youth. Her childhood experiences, long submerged, rushed back to her, and she was forced to confront her buried memories of killing her mother and her first spren. With the emotional support of her loving husband Adolin, Shallan began regaining her sense of self, overpowering Formless and subsuming one of her personas, Veil, back into herself. With the anti-human leadership of the Honor Spren discredited, more Honor Spren were now free to enter Roshar and bond new Radiance, while Shallan abandoned her mission to kill Kalak, cutting her ties with the Ghostbloods, and making an enemy of one of the most powerful organizations in the entire Cosmere. With Dalinar on the warpath in Emul, the Queen of Urithiru, Navani Kholin, was left in charge in his absence. Navani was uniquely qualified for this role. As a brilliant artifabrian, she and her team of scholars were uniquely qualified to research the tower's long-dormant magical systems. However, Navani's quest to unearth Urithiru's ancient secrets was interrupted when she began receiving anonymous span-read communications from a non-human entity which accused her of being an enslaver of spren. Little did Navani know her mysterious accuser was the sibling, the spren of Urithiru. The sibling was primordial and immensely powerful. Equal to the Nightwatcher and Stormfather, it was the child of both honor and cultivation. The sibling was the power behind Urithiru's magical systems. These included environmental regulation controls, which warmed the frigid mountain air around the tower, and an anti-magic suppression system, which nullified voidlight-powered surges. These systems were all controlled via a crystal pillar deep in the core of the tower, protected by a magical ward powered by 4 ancient fabrial nodes embedded throughout the tower. In ancient times, the sibling had bonded to a radiant bondsmith, who they had allowed to control the tower systems. However, they had clear issues with the new generation of modern humans who had come to inhabit their tower body, resenting their new fabrial creation methods, which involved the forced entrapment of mindless lesser spren within gemstones, something the sibling considered to be akin to slavery. Suddenly, Urithiru was blindsided by a surprise attack by an army of singers. Somehow, the fused in charge of the assault managed to invert the tower's suppression fabrial, so that it switched from disabling Voidlight to disabling Stormlight, causing the remaining Radiants in the tower to lose their powers and fall unconscious. Only 2 Radiants remained lucid after this, Kaladin, who was further along his oaths than all other Radiants, and thus better able to resist the suppression fabrial, and Lift, who was unique in that her powers were powered not by Stormlight, but Cultivation's Lifelight. Despite mounting a valiant resistance effort with the few soldiers she had, Navani soon realized the situation was hopeless, and in order to prevent further loss of life, surrendered to the leader of the occupation force. That leader was the fused known as Raboniel, the Lady of Wishes, an immortal scholar and peerless genius armed with millennia of knowledge and ambition. In taking Urithiru, Raboniel sought only one thing: to permanently end the Cycle of Desolations, which she had been living through for thousands of years. We will end this war, Pursuer, forever. We have spent far, far too long in an endless cycle. I will break it, and once I'm finished in this tower, there will be no turning back, ever. The Lady of Wishes to her fellow fused, Lesian the Pursuer. Raboniel was stern yet fair. Although she stripped Navani of her queenhood, she recognized her brilliance and offered her a new position as a scholar under her administration. Navani accepted, and together with Raboniel, achieved several major magitechnical breakthroughs, including the discovery of anti-Stormlight and anti-Voidlight, antimatter essences capable of permanently destroying Radiant Spren and the Fused. These discoveries were monumental, for they represented the ability to finally end the Cycle of Desolations once and for all. However, despite their mutual respect for each other's brilliance, which bordered on a growing friendship, Raboniel and Navani were still enemies. Raboniel was searching for the fabrial nodes which protected the tower's core, so she could access its crystal control pillar and corrupt it with Voidlight, turning the sibling, and by extension Urithiru, into a thing of odium. Navani was desperately trying to prevent this from happening, and had been secretly communicating with the sibling, who, despite their mistrust of modern humans, decided to reluctantly work alongside the deposed queen to protect herself from the Fused. Navani was also secretly in contact with Kaladin, who had gone into hiding in the bowels of the tower. He was joined by Lift, who used her Edge Dancer healing abilities to wake up Teft. Together, the few active Radiants left in the tower played a dangerous game of cat and mouse with the occupiers, protecting the nodes while evading detection from a pantheon of dangerous minions, such as Moash and a Fused known as the Pursuer, who had been killed by Kaladin once before and was determined to get his revenge, no matter how many reincarnations it took. Meanwhile, Venli, the last of the listeners, was also in Urithiru, serving as one of Raboniel's attendants. Racked by guilt for her role in the destruction of her people and chafing against the short leash the Fused had her on, Venli was now secretly leading an underground movement of singers who sought to escape Fused control, and escape into the Shattered Plains, as Venli's listener ancestors had done thousands of years ago. Ever since departing from the Shattered Plains, she had been shadowed by a light spren called Timbra, who had been encouraging her to act more selflessly. After living a life of self-interest, which had led to the destruction of her people, Venli now began doing what was right. This included helping even the humans she hated most. When Lift was captured, Venli secretly helped free her, and when the Fused began killing unconscious Radiants in their beds, she rose up in open revolt with a dissenting Fused, the Honourable Shanae Imleshwi. Through her noble actions, Venli bonded with Timbra, becoming perhaps the first singer to become a Knight Radiant in all of history, and proving that humans and singers could coexist in harmony. As the situation in the tower escalated into open revolt, Moash killed Teft, driving Kaladin into deep despair. Following Moash's orders, the Pursuer seized Kaladin's father and threw him off the top of Urithiru, hoping to push Kaladin into suicide. In desperation, Kaladin leapt after his father, powerless to save him as his surge binding remained suppressed. As he fell, the Stormfather intervened, slowing time and granting Kaladin a vision of his late brother Tien. In this heartfelt farewell, Kaladin released the guilt he had carried and swore the fourth ideal. His surge binding returned with explosive force, breaking through the suppression fabrial. Windspren coalesced around him, forming into Shardplate. Empowered, Kaladin saved his father, secured him safely, and killed the Pursuer decisively. Meanwhile, Navani, having prepared fabrial traps, gravely wounded Raboniel with an anti-Voidlight dagger, but failed to finish her. This failure proved vital when Moash returned for Navani. Raboniel delayed him just long enough for Navani to bond with the sibling. As a newly ascended bondsmith, Navani drove Moash away, restored the tower's defenses, and sent the invaders fleeing. Thus Urithiru was liberated, but with Odium's forces still occupying half of Roshar, the war was far from over. Recognizing the stalemate they were in, Dalinar and Odium came to the bargaining table. After some harrowing back and forth, which involved haggling over the fate of entire nations and peoples, the god of passion and the representative of the dead god of oaths came to an agreement. The final terms are these: a contest of champions to the death. On the 10th day of the month Pala, 10th hour, we will send a willing champion, allowed to meet at the top of Urithiru, otherwise unharmed by either side's forces. If I win that contest, you will remain bound to the system, but you will return Alethkar and Herdas to me, with all of their occupants intact. You will vow to cease any hostilities and maintain the peace, not working against my allies or our kingdoms in any way. Agreed, Odium said. But if I win, I keep everything I've won, including your homeland. I still remain bound to this system, and will still cease hostilities as you said above. But I will have your soul, to serve me immortal. Will you do this? Because I agree to these terms. And I, Dalinar whispered, I agree to these terms. It is done. Sometime later, Taravangian was visited in his prison by both Szeth and Odium, the former to kill Taravangian out of revenge for the atrocities he was forced to commit under his name, the latter to berate him over his failures to properly betray Dalinar's coalition. Unbeknownst to either of them, Taravangian had lured both the Assassin in White and the Void God into the same place at the same time by design. As Odium pulled Taravangian into a vision in the cognitive realm, the senile old king seized the cognitive reflection of Szeth's sword, the otherworldly blade which was the most powerful magical object in the Cosmere. As Szeth slew Taravangian's body in the physical realm, Taravangian's spirit used Nightblood to kill Odium. Yet one cannot truly kill a shard of Adonelsium, only its vessel. Race, the man who had become Odium after the shattering of Adonelsium, was killed, but Odium itself, the fragment of the creator deity of the Cosmere, remained. So it was that, lured by the irresistible promise of power, Taravangian was subsumed, becoming the very thing he had just destroyed. As of the publishing of this video, the fate of Roshar hangs in the balance. How will the contest of champions end, and how will it reshape the landscape of the storm-swept planet? How will Taravangian differ from Race as the vessel of Odium? And will the Knights Radiant finally triumph over the evil god once and for all? Those answers await us in the pages of Brandon Sanderson's newly released series finale, The Knights of Wind and Truth. Thus ends our abridged retelling of the first 4 books of the Stormlight Archive series. However, we have many more stories to tell. To make sure you don't miss them, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we will catch you on the next one.